On May the 13th, 1943, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill received a communication from one of his most senior commanders. The message was simple, direct, and very welcome. Sir, it is my duty to report that the Tunisian campaign is over. All enemy resistance has ceased. We are the masters of the North African shores. The news could hardly have been better. Britain and her allies had won a strategic victory, and Churchill was delighted. The way was now clear for an assault against the European heartlands of the enemy. The message from North Africa signaled the end of a 6-month campaign that began in the aftermath of the Battle of El Alamein. But even as the fighting raged in the deserts of Egypt, the British commander General Montgomery knew that the Allied presence in North Africa was about to be reinforced. After the victory at Alamein, Montgomery's 8th Army began a pursuit of the Panzerarmee Africa, led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. At the same time, a huge Allied fleet prepared to land a second Allied army on African shores. In the early days of November 1942, the largest amphibious landing force in history made final preparations off the coasts of northwest Africa. Its ultimate destination, the Vichy France colony of Tunisia. This was a combined army. For the first time in the Second World War, troops from the United States joined with their colleagues from Great Britain in a bold attempt to push the enemy out of North Africa for good. On the map, the objective looked straightforward. As Montgomery's 8th Army pushed the Axis westwards from Egypt, the new First Army would advance from the other side to squeeze the German and Italian presence until their resistance was broken. On the 13th of May 1943, the Allied leadership knew that their plan had succeeded, and victory in North Africa was theirs. It was one of the most memorable campaigns of the whole war, involving famous commanders and legendary weapons. Soldiers of both sides displayed great courage in a harsh physical environment that tested the endurance of the strongest men. This was the campaign that took place on the battlefield of Tunisia. It was an Allied victory whose story began at a time when it was the Axis who seemed irresistible. In June 1940, Adolf Hitler basked in his own glory as he celebrated the greatest victory of his German armed forces. The Führer's presence in Paris confirmed the German conquest of continental Western Europe. Hitler had finally avenged his country's defeat in the First World War a generation before. He was now the master of France. But the German Reich chose not to occupy the whole of the country. In the south, a new France was established, a rump state, with its capital at Vichy. Though Vichy France was officially independent under the leadership of the aging Philippe Pétain, her room for maneuver was limited. The new state could not risk upsetting Germany. Everyone knew what was likely to happen if it did. But Vichy France did have one significant responsibility. She was left in charge of French colonies in North Africa, at a time when European influence in the region was strong. In the west, France controlled the territories of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. To the east, Egypt lay within the British sphere of influence. Libya was under the authority of Mussolini's Italy. It was here, in September 1940, that 44 months of armed conflict began. This was the Desert War that came to its final conclusion in Tunisia. In June 1940, the Italian leader Mussolini decided to bring his nation into the action of the Second World War. With France on the point of defeat, Mussolini thought he could take advantage of the situation by launching his own invasion of southern France. Il Duce wanted some glory of his own. What he got was an embarrassing defeat. His invasion force was defeated by a French army of inferior numbers. But Mussolini did not lose his ambition for conquest. 3 months later, he launched another military enterprise, an attack on Egypt by his powerful Libyan army. This time, the result was even more humiliating for the Italian leader. The reasoning behind the invasion can be seen on a 1940 map of the North Africa region. At the time, Italy was already dominant in Libya. To the southeast, Abyssinia was also in Italian possession. Mussolini's plan was to connect his two colonies, beginning with the conquest of Egypt. It seemed like a straightforward task. The Italian army in Libya numbered 300,000. In neighbouring Egypt, the British Western Desert Force of Major General Richard O'Connor numbered 30,000. The British were outnumbered 10-1, but it was the Italians who soon found themselves on a costly retreat after their offensive began in September 1940. After an initial advance of some 60 miles into Egypt, the British struck back in December. Within days, the Italians were in flight. By February the 7th, 1941, the British had captured no less than 130,000 enemy troops in the course of a remarkable counter-offensive. By the time Churchill decided to direct his regional resources to the fighting in Greece, the British had also taken a huge chunk of African territory. When the British leader called a halt to the advance, Britain had captured the whole of eastern Libya. It was a humiliation for Italy, and their German allies were not prepared to let the situation rest. In February 1941, Hitler dispatched one of his most gifted soldiers to the city of Tripoli in western Libya. General Erwin Rommel was given command of a new German presence in the region, the Afrika Korps. The British were to find Rommel a far more vigorous adversary. In the months that followed Rommel's arrival, the Germans proved themselves far more effective soldiers than their Italian allies. 1941 saw the Afrika Korps push the British back, recapturing virtually all of the territory lost by the Italians. The city of Tobruk was besieged for 8 months, and the hardships endured by the Allied men trapped there became the stuff of legend. But the second half of 1941 saw the besiegers dominant in the desert fighting. Only when Rommel overreached himself in an ambitious dash to the Egyptian border could the British mount an effective counterattack. On December the 10th, 1941, the siege of Tobruk was lifted as Rommel led his men back across Libyan territory. The liberation of Tobruk seemed like a great achievement at the time. Church bells rang out across Britain to celebrate a first victory over German ground forces. But in early 1942, the enemy commander in Africa hit back in style. The Axis retreat from Tobruk was well organized and deliberate, and Rommel was soon back on the offensive. At the age of 50, Erwin Rommel was now the youngest field marshal in the Wehrmacht. He had also acquired the nickname Desert Fox, and the first half of 1942 confirmed his growing status as a commander of guile and cunning. From January to July, Rommel led his new Panzerarmee Afrika on a relentless advance across northern Libya. At Gizala, he overcame a considerable Allied defense with a combination of tactical ingenuity and battlefield flexibility. His clever deployment of armour and artillery proved especially valuable as the British-led 8th Army struggled to respond. By the 13th of June, the British commanders were forced to order a retreat, and there was worse to come. At Gizala, the British leadership was ineffective. When Rommel sought to recapture the port of Tobruk, his opposing commanders proved little better than incompetent. Poor intelligence combined with panic-stricken leadership resulted in a British loss of huge symbolic significance. A week after the defeat at Gazala, the British had also conceded Tobruk, a turn of events that many in London found hard to take. Still, the Panzer Army swept forward, crossing the Libyan border into Egypt itself. The Allied presence in North Africa was now in real danger. The city of Cairo flew into a panic as the retreating British established a new defensive line just 60 miles west of the Egyptian capital. But the position was well chosen, stretching south from the settlement of El Alamein to the impassable Qattara Depression in the south. An outflanking maneuver was out of the question. Despite the best efforts of the Axis forces under Rommel's command, the British line held against a series of direct assaults in July 1942. By the end of the month, two exhausted armies paused to regroup as the British leadership considered their next move. The British commander in Egypt was General Claude Auchinleck. Following the disaster at Tobruk, he took personal charge of the 8th Army, in addition to his duties as Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East region. It was Auchinleck's decision to form his defence at El Alamein that finally halted Rommel's great advance across North Africa. But back in London, Churchill was deeply concerned with events in Africa, and in early August he visited the front himself, with changes very much in his mind. In early August, Churchill decided to place his African forces under new leadership. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery was appointed as the new commander of the 8th Army, under the overall regional command of General Sir Harold Alexander. These were the men on whom the Allies would depend when fighting resumed in the Egyptian desert. Though Montgomery had no experience of the desert fighting, he was quick to prove himself a master of the African battlefield. In early September, his men succeeded in thwarting a final attempt by Rommel to break through the 8th Army line at Halfa. The British commander could be well pleased with his achievement. Less than 3 weeks after arriving in Africa, Bernard Montgomery had defeated the Desert Fox, and an army that had been in poor shape when he arrived began to recover its fighting spirit. Now its commander was to consider his own next move in Egypt. By early October, Montgomery had decided to launch an offensive of his own. But back in London, the British leadership had already been involved in decisions concerning much wider regional objectives in the lands of northern Africa. In the early months of 1942, the British leadership engaged in an ongoing debate with their counterparts in the United States. As soon as America entered the war in December 1941, the question of how best to deploy her resources became a matter for serious consideration. At the time, the German army was engaged in a ferocious campaign deep inside the frontiers of the Soviet Union. If the British and Americans could draw Hitler's attention elsewhere, the pressure on Stalin and the Russians would be eased. In early 1942, the Western Allies were keen to open this second front. The only question was where. In Washington, many leading figures in the General Staff argued for an assault against Western Europe. But the British maintained that even with American support, the success of a continental invasion could not be guaranteed. The American industrial machine was not yet fully geared up for war production, and so the idea of an invasion of Africa began to gain favor. When Rommel launched his summer offensive against the 8th Army in Libya, the argument for such an enterprise grew compelling as the British retreated into Egypt. By the time General Auchinleck halted the German advance near El Alamein, the American president was all but convinced. Roosevelt was determined to deploy his armed forces against the European Axis powers, and when no agreement could be reached for an attack against the continent, he accepted the British idea of an operation in North Africa. It was decided that instead of joining the British in Egypt, a new American force should be sent to the other side of the North African region. By the end of July 1942, the Western Allies agreed that a huge amphibious force should be landed in the region. For the first time in the Second World War, American and British forces would join together in action against the Axis powers. 107,000 troops were allocated for the landings, an enterprise that marked the beginning of the Tunisia campaign. It was given the codename Operation Torch. On the 26th of July 1942, President Roosevelt appointed the commander to take overall charge of Operation Torch. Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower had never engaged in active combat, but he had established a name for himself in the planning department of the Washington staff. And he quickly added to his reputation as the detailed planning for Operation Torch began. In the weeks that followed Eisenhower's appointment, transatlantic discussions between the British and Americans considered issues such as landing sites, timetables, and troop dispositions. The arguments were often heated, though all were united on the strategic objective of the task ahead. The plan was to capture the territories of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, and expose what became known as the soft underbelly of the enemy: Sicily, and then Italy. But the political situation in North Africa presented the Allies with a serious problem. Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia were all under the control of Vichy France. No fewer than 100,000 troops were stationed on the ground, and the Allies could not be sure how their commanders would react in the event of an invasion. Part of the problem was an anti-British feeling that characterized Vichy France as a whole. Many French leaders could not forgive Britain for sinking her North African fleet at Oran in 1940. But it had never broken off contact with the United States, so the Allies decided that Operation Torch should appear to be as American as possible. For this reason, the late summer of 1942 saw American attempts to find a French leader with sufficient authority to persuade the local North African commanders to support the Allied landings. One high-profile figure considered inappropriate was General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the London-based Free French. Another option was Lieutenant General Henri Giraud. A war hero and former prisoner, Giraud escaped from German captivity and returned to Vichy France, where he was allowed to live freely, although under surveillance. By the time the planning for Operation Torch was completed, it was intended that Giraud be smuggled out of France and taken to North Africa in the Allied cause. If he could persuade his fellow Frenchmen to back the Americans and British, the potential advantages were obvious. But the Allied desire to keep Operation Torch as secret as possible meant that Giraud was not informed of the full picture. This remained the case even after the Allies had identified him as the most likely figure to drum up support for the Allied invasion. But the French general must have suspected that something big was about to happen when he was secretly picked up on the Mediterranean coast and taken to Gibraltar on a British submarine. Only then, on November the 7th, was he told that Operation Torch would begin in a matter of hours. Until then, he knew nothing of the details of the Allied assault. He was not the only one. The arrival of 3 huge task forces would also come as a surprise to the French commanders on the ground in North Africa. The ambitious objectives of Operation Torch can be identified on the North African map. On the coasts of Morocco, the Western Task Force of General George S. Patton were given the task of capturing the port of Casablanca. Their landings would be made after a sea voyage from bases on the east coast of the United States. For the capture of Algeria, 2 further task forces were required, both of them sailing from bases in the United Kingdom. The Central Task Force of General Friedenhall was detailed to capture the region around the port of Oran, while the Eastern Task Force of General Ryder intended to move against the Algerian capital of Algiers. All commanders knew of the possibility of French resistance. Their hope was that Giraud and others could minimize its impact. It was possible that the capture of Algeria and Morocco could be an expensive enterprise, and these were only the first objectives of Operation Torch. As soon as the landings had been made successfully, the Allies intended to form a new First Army to advance eastwards towards Tunisia. The presence of Axis air power in Sicily and southern Italy meant that this final objective would have to be achieved by a ground operation, and it was likely that an Allied army already in Africa would be involved. On the 7th of November 1942, Eisenhower and his colleagues made final preparations for the launch of Operation Torch from their base in Gibraltar. And they knew that the strategic situation in North Africa had already altered in the most dramatic manner as a result of events in faraway Egypt. There, a massive and historic engagement had just concluded, a battle between two great armies who would also play a key role in the fighting for Tunisia. On the 23rd of October 1942, at 21:40 hours, a huge artillery barrage shattered the silence of the Egyptian desert. It was an Allied attack, a ferocious 15-minute onslaught that marked the beginning of the Battle of El Alamein. 20 minutes later, the engineers and infantrymen of Montgomery's 8th Army advanced into a formidable German defensive line. Their job was to clear the way for the armoured units that would play the decisive role in the battle to come. For the first time, the British desert forces were able to engage the Panzerarmee Africa with a real sense of confidence. In the preceding months, the 8th Army took delivery of substantial reinforcements of men and material. Powerful American Sherman tanks now proved themselves on the African battlefield, and Montgomery enjoyed an overall advantage in resources of approximately 2-1. The efforts of Allied code breakers also meant that Montgomery enjoyed superior intelligence. The 8th Army commander knew that when he launched his attack on October the 23rd, his great rival Rommel was nowhere near the battlefield. Instead, he was ill with jaundice on sick leave in Austria. Montgomery also succeeded in keeping his own intentions secret. By using effective camouflage and by deploying a dummy army to the south of his line, Montgomery fooled the enemy into thinking his attack would come from this direction. Instead, his main assault force intended to break through nearer the coast. When the 8th Army launched their attack with a huge artillery barrage on the evening of October the 23rd, Montgomery had achieved full tactical surprise. His opponent was soon out of his sickbed and flying back to the desert. But not even the great Rommel could beat the odds that faced him at the Battle of El Alamein. However, it took 12 days of bitter fighting before the 8th Army broke through his line, and the reputation of the Desert Fox remained intact. Even with Rommel absent, the Germans and Italians put up a stiff resistance to Montgomery's attack. Early in the battle, the main British armoured division found itself bogged down on what was an insignificant ridge in the desert landscape. But the two sides fought for this ridge as if it was the most valuable plot of land on Earth. 88mm German guns pounded the British armour. The Axis positions found themselves assaulted from the air. Many German panzers fell victim to the 40mm cannon of the British Hurricane 2D. When Rommel returned to the battlefield, he found a scene of devastation and destruction, but his line still held. And on the 4th day of fighting, he unleashed no fewer than 5 counterattacks with his remaining armoured resources. On a day of bloody combat, all of them were repulsed, but still the 8th Army could make the breakthrough into the open desert as the battlefield shook with the force of war. Montgomery was forced to pause and reorganize his resources to make the decisive breakthrough, as all the time his material advantage increased. On November the 4th, 1942, the leading British armoured divisions smashed their way into the open desert, and the Battle of El Alamein was over. But the North African War continued. By the time the British tanks broke through at El Alamein, the crafty Rommel was already retreating, and he was able to continue his retreat in good order towards Tunisia, as the British took up the chase. In the end, Rommel was able to save what was left of his Panzerarmee Africa to fight another day. Many have argued that his great rival Montgomery was too cautious in his pursuit, but the British commander knew something that Rommel didn't. As the Desert Fox began his retreat, 3 Allied fleets were forming into position around the coasts to the northwest of the African landmass. Montgomery knew that Operation Torch was about to begin. Before long, he and Rommel would meet again in combat. But they were not the only great leaders who displayed their skills on the battlefield of Tunisia. Of all the commanders who saw service in the Second World War, perhaps none achieved the worldwide fame of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. It's unlikely that the man universally known as Ike would have become President of the United States in 1953 if it had not been for his military exploits in the previous decade. But when Lieutenant General Eisenhower was appointed to command the Torch landings in July 1942, it was a decision that came as a surprise to many. At the time, he was 51 years of age, but he had never taken a command post in battle. During the First World War, Eisenhower was responsible for a tank corps training center. In the years that followed, he worked in the Command and General Staff School before his appointment as Chief of Staff to the 3rd U.S. Army in 1941. Throughout this period, Eisenhower impressed his superiors with his charm and administrative skill, and it was this that led Roosevelt to appoint him commander of U.S. forces in Europe in June 1942. The fighting in North Africa gave Eisenhower his first chance to demonstrate his abilities in the field. By May 1943, he'd proved himself a leader in battle, and subsequent postings in Sicily, Italy, and especially northwest Europe only added to his fame. By the time the fighting in Tunisia came to an end, his most senior British subordinate had also established his reputation. In contrast to Eisenhower, General Sir Harold Alexander was well acquainted with field operations by the time of the Tunisia campaign. Born in 1891, Alexander served with distinction as an officer during the grim fighting of World War I. By the time war broke out again in 1939, Alexander had attained the rank of Major General, and he was given a divisional command in the British Expeditionary Force sent to France. It was the beginning of a brilliant war. At Dunkirk, Harold Alexander was responsible for the amazing evacuation of the British Army almost from under the noses of the Germans. A senior command in the jungles of Burma followed, before Churchill appointed him Commander-in-Chief of British Middle East Forces in August 1942. As such, he was in overall charge of the great victory at El Alamein, and his remarkable career did not end in Egypt. By the end of the Battle of Tunisia, General Alexander was commander of the Allied 18th Army Group and answerable only to Eisenhower. Like his American superior, Alexander also went on to serve in Sicily and Italy before a successful political career after the war. But it's for his leadership in Africa that Alexander is best remembered. Much of Alexander's reputation derived from his excellent working relationship with his own subordinate in Africa, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery. The two men got on extremely well, perhaps in part because of the similarity of their military careers. 3 years older than Alexander, Montgomery also served with distinction during the Great War. Like Alexander, Montgomery took charge of a division within the British Expeditionary Force in 1939. After excelling himself at Dunkirk, his next big appointment came in the summer of 1942, when he was given command of the 8th Army in Egypt. He had now acquired the nickname Monty, and he cut a distinctive figure with his trademark two-badge beret. He was already one of the most recognizable faces in the British Army. After the victory at El Alamein, he became one of the best-known faces of his nation. Montgomery ended the war as a field marshal and commander-in-chief of British armies on the Western European front. Known as a cautious commander, the only blight on his magnificent service record came when he proposed the one genuinely radical operation of his career, the failed attempt to capture the bridge at Arnhem in September 1944. But his achievements elsewhere were substantial, and like his superior Alexander, Montgomery took a post-war title that reflected his achievements in North Africa: Viscount Montgomery of El Alamein. Despite Montgomery's trademark tactical caution, he was one of the great showmen of the British Army and a great inspiration to his men. But in November 1942, he was not the only great showman fighting for the Allies in North Africa. In charge of the westernmost sector of the Torch landings was an American commander who could never be accused of caution: George S. Patton. Operation Torch marked the debut of American forces against the Axis powers in Europe, and George Patton was determined to seize the limelight. But it was not until March 1943 that he was able to get into the thick of the action as commander of the American Second Corps. But when he did, he made an immediate impact, reinforcing the morale and the discipline of a body of troops who'd suffered from poor leadership in the face of concerted enemy activity. Known for his industrial language, Patton's aggression could lead to difficulties. During the 1943 campaign in Sicily, the American general physically attacked two shell-shocked men who he believed to be guilty of cowardice. Patton was withdrawn from frontline duties, but his skills as a soldier were too good to ignore. In 1944, he sealed his reputation for boldness as commander of the US Third Army that finally broke out of the Normandy bridgehead. His death in a traffic accident in 1945 was a great loss to the American Army and the American nation. Patton's aggressive nature was not restricted to his subordinates. He was more than capable of fierce exchanges with his fellow commanders, and there were times when his relationship with his fellow showman Montgomery was tense. Fortunately for the Allies, Eisenhower's diplomatic skills kept any tensions in check during the Tunisia campaign. Their enemy was not so fortunate. When Operation Torch began on the 8th of November 1942, its ultimate objective was Tunisia, a country without any Axis troops in residence. But the Allies could be all but certain that the enemy leadership would move quickly to alter the situation, and they were proved right. In a matter of weeks, the 5th German Panzer Army was established on Tunisian soil, and on December the 9th, 1942, its command was given to Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. At the age of 53, von Arnim had already enjoyed a distinguished military career. In June 1941, he impressed his political leaders with his skills as a panzer commander during the invasion of Russia. Though he was wounded early in the conflict, he was never forgotten, and he was the ideal choice for command of the new army established in Tunisia in response to Operation Torch. Like his British counterpart, Montgomery, von Arnim was an instantly recognizable figure, with his immaculate jackboots and studious monocle. Von Arnim also shared an instinct for caution with his British rival, an instinct that marked him out from his most famous colleague during the Battle of Tunisia. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has always been one of the best remembered figures of the Second World War. A charismatic soldier with a strong personal presence, Rommel's active service career began on the battlefields of the First World War, where he earned Germany's highest award for bravery. By the start of World War II, he'd risen to the rank of Major General, and his legend was already beginning to form. In 1940, as commander of the 7th Panzer Division, Rommel led a devastating German advance to the coast of the English Channel, earning a Knight's Cross in the process. 1941 was another year of glory. Appointed commander of the new Africa Corps in February, by December he was the youngest field marshal in the German army. Rommel liked to think of himself as possessing the cunning nature of the fox. Almost as soon as he arrived in Africa, he acquired the nickname by which he's still known today, the Desert Fox. Time and again, Rommel was able to seize the initiative with tactical surprise, and his troops recognized the special talents of their battlefield commander. Rommel was almost worshipped by the men under his command. To talk of a cult of Rommel in the German ranks would not be an exaggeration, and this powerful admiration even extended to the general's enemies. When Montgomery first arrived in Africa, he found many of his own men obsessed with Rommel, always wondering what the great Desert Fox was going to do next. Monty's first task in Africa was to persuade his troops that they too could achieve great victories. But admiration for Rommel did not extend to his colleague Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. Unfortunately for the Axis cause, the two German commanders possessed a strong dislike for each other. On at least one occasion, Axis momentum in Tunisia was lost because of arguments between the two men. Rommel thought von Arnim to be too cautious. Von Arnim thought the opposite of Rommel. The Desert Fox also argued with his superiors, but his opinions were not always so enthusiastic when it came to his colleagues. The structure of the Axis command in North Africa meant that the Desert Fox was formally answerable to the commander-in-chief of all German forces in the Mediterranean region, Albert Kesselring. Born in 1889, Albert Kesselring first trained as a gunner, but by the end of World War I, he enjoyed a position within Imperial Germany's General Staff. In the 1930s, he joined the Young Luftwaffe, and in 1939 he was a Luftflotte commander during the invasion of Poland. Kesselring also took part in the Battle of Britain, and despite the German defeat, his career continued to advance with his appointment as German Commander-in-Chief South. Later on in the war, Kesselring secured his reputation as a leader with his imaginative defense of the Italian peninsula, but in Africa his contribution was perhaps less impressive. Rommel argued with Kesselring repeatedly, believing that his superior was not prepared to commit sufficient air power to the North African theatre. This was just one of the many disputes within the Axis leadership during the Tunisian campaign, and Hitler himself was often involved in the arguments. There is no doubt that the Allies enjoyed a smoother command of the resources that they brought to the Tunisia battlefield. The American entry into the war against the European Axis powers could hardly have been more dramatic. The final plan for Operation Torch called for an amphibious landing of 107,000 men under arms. 84,000 were Americans, the rest British. The plans also allowed for reinforcements to arrive once the campaign on the ground was underway. These new forces were in addition to the existing Allied presence in Africa. As the Torch landings began, Montgomery's 8th Army was advancing through Libya towards Tunisia. This was an international force, with units drawn from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India backing up the British. In the aftermath of El Alamein, Montgomery could call on the manpower of 180,000 troops. When the fighting for Tunisia reached its final stages, the Allied presence in Africa totaled some 380,000 men. It was a total that their enemies could only wish for. In early November 1942, the Axis presence in Tunisia was nil, but as soon as the news of the Torch landings came through, the German and Italian leaderships moved quickly to establish a ground force to resist the Allied offensive. Just days after the first Allied troops stepped ashore, the Axis command announced the creation of the new 5th Panzer Army, based in Tunisia. By the end of November, 15,500 new German and Italian troops had arrived in North Africa. A month later, General von Arnim could call on the resources of 65,000 men, of whom 47,000 were German. The Panzer Army Africa of Erwin Rommel was also part of the picture. Despite heavy losses at El Alamein, the Desert Fox still commanded a force of 54,000, and Axis reinforcements continued to arrive in Africa until the last weeks of the Tunisia campaign. But it was the Allies who enjoyed the numerical superiority by the time the fighting in Tunisia neared its end. For the final battles, the Axis presence in Tunisia totaled 175,000 against an Allied presence more than twice the size. The Allies also enjoyed a substantial advantage in all forms of military material. But the fighting in Tunisia saw both sides deploy some of the finest weapons seen in any theatre of the Second World War. The fighting in North Africa revealed a number of similarities with other theatres of operations during World War II. The importance of the tank for successful offensive warfare was as relevant in North Africa as it was in Russia or the Western Front. At El Alamein, the newly arrived American Sherman tanks made a big difference to Allied success, and the powerful Shermans had a key role to play in the battles for Tunisia. But the Allies were also able to call on other excellent machines as the Tunisia offensive unfolded. Towards the end of the campaign, the first consignment of Mark IV Churchill tanks arrived in the theatre. Early models of the Churchill were known for their heavy armour and relative lack of speed, and the Mark IV continued in the tradition. What made the Mark IV different was its impressive main gun. At El Alamein, the Shermans had proved the value of a 75mm caliber weapon. The Mark IV Churchill was similarly armed, and despite its lack of speed, the Mark IV proved to have excellent mobility in hilly conditions, something that could be well appreciated in the sloping terrain that defined much of the Tunisian landscape. But the Tunisian battles were not restricted to the ground. All through the Desert War, air power was generously deployed. At El Alamein, the Allied superiority in the air made a huge contribution to victory, with the ground attack Hurricane 2D playing an especially important role. The Hawker Hurricane 2D was designed specifically as an anti-tank weapon. An earlier model had proved itself during the Battle of Britain. For its duties in North Africa, the Hurricane's design was modified. The big difference with the Type 2D was its armament. Other versions of the Hurricane were fitted with 12 machine guns or 4 20mm cannon. The 2D used at Alamein was armed with 2 weapons of 40mm caliber. This was more than enough to open up a panzer at the time of the Tunisia campaign. The 2D was sometimes known as the Tank Buster, but its firepower meant that it also gained another nickname, the Tin Opener. In Tunisia, the German armoured units could understand why. Neutralizing the impact of the panzers was a vital objective for the Allied commanders in Tunisia. In many engagements, the traditional 6-pound anti-tank gun proved more than enough to deal with the German armour. But a new generation of German tanks was now coming into commission, with heavier armour up to 110mm thick. Fortunately for the Allies, they were able to respond with a new weapon of their own, the British 17-pound anti-tank gun. In late 1942, the first hurriedly prepared 17-pounders arrived in Africa as a direct response to the new generation of heavy panzers. In early 1943, the new guns made their battlefield debut when Rommel launched his final offensive on the African continent. Their impact was devastating. The 76.2mm shells could penetrate armour to a thickness of 130mm, and there was nothing that any panzer crew could do against a direct hit within a 1-kilometre range. For closer engagements, the Allies relied on another memorable weapon to cause maximum damage to the German armoured units. Early in 1942, the American Army took delivery of its first batch of handheld anti-tank weapons, the bazookas. For the first time in battle, the individual infantryman could make an impact against a tank. He had to be close to the target. The M1 bazooka's maximum effective range was only 130 yards. Armed with a weapon that could penetrate 80 millimeters of armor, the bazooka soldier could make a devastating impact in armored engagements. It was little short of a revolution in warfare. But in Tunisia, there were some German tanks against whose armor the bazooka could make little impact. At El Alamein, the Type 4 German panzers that had previously seemed invincible found themselves outgunned. On the ground, the American-built Sherman proved to be the superior machine. The Type 4 was also vulnerable against air attack from the Hurricanes. But its 75mm gun was still a force to be reckoned with, and the Type 4 contributed to every armoured offensive launched by von Arnim and Rommel during the Tunisian fighting. But what both German commanders really wanted was the new Type 6 Panzer, the Tiger. At El Alamein, Rommel was promised delivery of a consignment of these monster vehicles. None arrived. But in late 1942, von Arnim did receive a delivery of Tigers. His relief was understandable. Defensively and offensively, the Type 6 represented a great leap forward in tank design. Its armor had a maximum thickness of 110 millimeters. The caliber of its gun was a massive 88 millimeters. Inevitably, it was a heavy machine. Its 56-ton weight meant that speed was sacrificed. For this reason, the Tigers were never deployed at divisional levels. But smaller Tiger units could make a devastating impact in battle, and a direct hit meant only one fate for the crews of a more lightly protected Allied tank. But of all the German weapons used in the Tunisia fighting, it may be that one was remembered most by the Allied men who witnessed it in action. Early in the war, the German military machine came up with the idea of the Nebelwerfer, or smoke thrower. This was a rocket launcher designed to create a tactical smoke screen on the battlefield. But it soon became clear that the 15-centimeter artillery rockets could also be used to fire explosive shells. The result was a towed weapon with 6 launching tubes, each capable of firing a 75-pound shell to a range of 1.5 miles. In Tunisia, the Nebelwerfer proved especially valuable against narrow Allied defensive positions. But it wasn't just the firepower that Allied soldiers recalled long after the war. It was the unsettling noise that the shells made in flight. The Nebelwerfer shells were quickly given the nickname Moaning Minis. Allied reaction was an understandable mixture of fear and admiration for a highly advanced weapon of its day. But as well as the latest in weapon design, the German forces in North Africa were also able to deploy machines that had already proved themselves in all theatres of World War II. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was a classic example. First used in the Spanish Civil War, the Bf-109 was the most famous of all German single-seat fighters during World War II. In the early months of the war, the 109 proved itself to be a devastating element of Hitler's blitzkrieg, though it struggled in the Battle of Britain against the more maneuverable Spitfires and Hurricanes. But it remained in service, and in Tunisia, the Bf-109 found a new lease of life as a low-flying warplane with impressive firepower. The Model G was typically armed with 2 13mm and 3 30mm cannon. Flying low, the 109 could make a serious impact on ground positions, and Allied troops found that it could fly so low that their own 40mm anti-aircraft guns were ineffective. So it was with a combination of old and new hardware that the Axis forces squared up to the Allied Tunisia offensive, an operation that was about to begin in early November 1942. On the evening of November the 7th, 1942, the Allies stood on the verge of launching the biggest amphibious landing in history. Off the coast of Morocco, the Western Task Force had sailed from the American East Coast and taken up position for an assault on Casablanca. In the Mediterranean, troops of the Central and Eastern task forces made ready for attacks on the ports of Oran and Algiers. At his Gibraltar headquarters, Eisenhower knew that his preparations were complete. The time for battle had arrived. Operation Torch would be just the first stage in the hard task of clearing the Axis forces from North Africa. The Allied commander could be confident in the men and materials under his command. But in war, there are always uncertainties. Eisenhower could not be sure how the local French troops would react to the invasion. He did not know how quickly the Axis would build up a presence in Tunisia. Far away in Libya, the charismatic figure of Rommel still led a substantial military force towards the border with Tunisia. There was also the reality that Operation Torch was the first time that American and British troops were joined in a single army. But Eisenhower could be sure that one way or another, a memorable campaign was about to begin. It would involve 6 months of fighting on the battlefield of Tunisia. On November the 4th, 1942, the armoured divisions of the British 8th Army smashed their way through the line of the German Panzerarmee Africa. In the deserts of Egypt, one of the most decisive engagements of the Second World War was at an end. The triumph of the 8th Army at the Battle of El Alamein proved to be a turning point in the struggle to control North Africa. And for British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, it marked the end of the beginning of the Second World War. But there was still more fighting to be done on the dry lands of North Africa. In the weeks that followed El Alamein, the German Field Marshal Rommel was able to withdraw his African army as his British rival Montgomery took up the chase. In the early days of November 1942, Montgomery could be well pleased with the progress of the Desert War. As he began his westward pursuit of Rommel, the 8th Army commander knew that a massive Allied operation was about to begin on the other side of the African continent. This was the biggest amphibious landing ever undertaken. Codenamed Torch, the operation was a joint British-American enterprise under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. 3 huge task forces were organized to bring an entirely new Allied army to the lands of North Africa. On November the 8th, 1942, a total of 107,000 troops prepared to go ashore on the coasts of Morocco and Algeria. At the time, both countries were colonies of Vichy France. There were no Germans or Italians waiting for the Allied troops in November 1942, but there were French colonial troops loyal to the Vichy regime. The Allies could not be sure how they would react to the invasion. Eisenhower and his fellow commanders were also concerned that the full force of the Axis enemy was likely to be present before their final objective could be achieved. But it was a worthwhile and ambitious objective. The plan was to force the enemy out of North Africa for good and open the way for an attack on Sicily and Italy beyond. The concerns of the Allied commanders were well-founded. Victory in North Africa would not be an easy task. For 6 long months, the Allies and the Axis joined in battle in a series of bloody engagements before the long North African War reached a final conclusion. The location was the third of the French North African possessions. It was a time that saw some of the most gripping confrontations of the Second World War. This was the battlefield of Tunisia. In July 1942, the political leaders in Washington and London made the decision to open a new front in the battle against Hitler and the Axis powers. At the time, Allied resources were still not powerful enough to risk a full-scale assault on northwest Europe. But there was a strong desire to bring American troops into action as quickly as possible. Anything that could draw enemy resources away from the terrible fighting in the Soviet Union would be a positive development for the Allied cause. There was also a strong desire to familiarize British and American forces with the idea of fighting alongside each other. By September, it was decided to launch a new offensive in the North African War that already had been raging for 2 long years. For the first time, the British and Americans were to join forces in a vast naval operation codenamed Torch. By the beginning of November, 3 Allied fleets were sailing towards strategic locations in the northwest of the African continent. It was a massive logistical enterprise. From the east coast of the United States, the Western Task Force sailed towards the Moroccan port of Casablanca. From ports in Scotland, the Central and Eastern Task Forces journeyed through the Straits of Gibraltar in the direction of 2 key ports in Algeria, Oran and Algiers. The Eastern Task Force was alone in containing British troops among its number. There were strong political reasons behind this decision. Morocco and Algeria were colonies administered by the rump French state based at Vichy, and the Vichy regime held a strong anti-British feeling. It had no diplomatic ties with Britain, but it did maintain contact with the United States. For this reason, Operation Torch was intended to look as much like an American enterprise as possible. But the United States was still not ready to launch an operation of the size of Torch without the assistance of the British, and the strategic prize on offer in North Africa was simply too good to ignore in late 1942. A successful landing in Morocco and Algeria could lead to the capture of Tunisia. There was now the chance to force the enemy out of North Africa for good. On the map, the Allied plan was obvious. The new Anglo-American army would sweep forward from the west, while the British-led 8th Army advanced from the east. And by the time of the Torch landings, this existing North African army was already moving forward. By early November 1942, times were changing in the Desert War. On the 4th, Montgomery sealed his great victory at El Alamein as Rommel's Panzerarmee began a retreat through Libya. The next day, the Central and Eastern Task Forces passed through the Straits of Gibraltar. At the same time, the Western Task Force approached the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Operation Torch was about to begin. Allied commanders knew that the Torch landings would not be opposed by Axis forces, but as H-hour approached, they could not be sure how French colonial troops on the ground would respond. This was just one uncertainty in the minds of the Allied commanders in the early hours of the 8th of November 1942, as the biggest amphibious landing in history began. In the weeks prior to the Torch landings, the Allies made a series of secret diplomatic efforts in an attempt to make the Torch landings as smooth as possible. Their aim was to gain support for the operation amongst French commanders in North Africa and in France itself. After much debate, the French war hero General Henri Giraud was identified as the key figure to bring his countrymen over to the Allied side in North Africa. On the eve of the landings, he was secretly picked up by a British submarine off the coast of southern France. His destination was Eisenhower's headquarters inside the Rock of Gibraltar, where he awaited developments with interest. But Allied attempts to drum up support amongst the French were thwarted by an excess of secrecy about their intentions. Giraud himself was only given full details at the last minute, and when the first landing craft left the task force fleets on November the 8th, there was still uncertainty about how the French would react on the ground. In a matter of minutes, the Allies had their answer. At all 3 landing sites, the local forces fought back against the invasion. At Algiers, 2 British destroyers made a direct assault on the port to land an attack group of 650 Americans. The local French commander's response was to unleash his harbour artillery against the British ships. HMS Malcolm was hit and forced to withdraw. HMS Broke was sent to the bottom, and the American attack group was forced to surrender to the colonial French forces. Fortunately for the Allies, the supporting landings to the east and west of Algiers faced less in the way of resistance. Despite further engagements with French troops, the Eastern Task Force succeeded in landing armoured American units, which swept quickly into the Algerian capital. On the first afternoon, the local French commander in Algiers made the decision to surrender. The first objective of Operation Torch had been achieved. The Central Task Force met with a similar response from Vichy forces. At Oran, another direct assault on the port was met by French artillery fire, and 2 landing ships were sunk in the harbour. 300 American lives were lost. The supporting landings also met with a vigorous French response, with heavy ground fighting on the beaches to the west of Oran before the Americans were able to put all their men ashore. But on the second day, the French mounted a counterattack against the newly landed forces. The intervention of American honey tanks was required before Oran eventually fell on the 10th of November. But it took 600 American casualties, with 275 killed, to secure the objective. In Morocco, the American landings also met with fierce resistance. At Casablanca, the direct assault on the port was opposed by a French battleship, the Jean Bart. The vessel was unfinished and certainly not fit for sea, but her 4 15-inch guns were in perfect working order, as the Americans soon found out. A full-scale battle between the Jean Bart and the USS Massachusetts broke out, an engagement that only ended with the intervention of Allied bombers. The supporting landings also had to fight their way towards the Casablanca objective, with their efforts hampered by difficulties unloading material on the landing beaches. The Western Task Force commander, George Patton, was furious. By the morning of the 11th of November, the Casablanca objective had still not been achieved, as the French continued to resist. But then the fighting came to a sudden end. In Algiers, the French announced an armistice. By chance, the deputy leader of Vichy France was in the city, and it was Admiral Jean-François Darlan who realized that further resistance was futile. Though Darlan's seniority within the Vichy regime led many to suspect him of Nazi sympathies, his accidental presence in Algiers meant that he became the French High Commissioner in Allied-occupied North Africa, much to the annoyance of Henri Giraud. But Darlan's authority in North Africa was short-lived. 6 weeks after the Allied landings, he fell victim to an assassin's bullet in the Algerian capital. His true loyalties remained in doubt until the end, and many Allied leaders were pleased when his death cleared the way for Henri Giraud to take over French administration in North Africa. But it was Darlan's armistice that brought the Torch landings to a successful conclusion, and the Allied command could be pleased with the first Anglo-American operation of the war, despite their losses at the hands of the French. Allied ground troops were immediately formed into the new British-led First Army of General Kenneth Anderson, and the objective of Tunisia could now be pursued. But a far more substantial enemy had already reacted to events. On the same day as the Algiers armistice, German troops marched into Vichy France. In the days that followed, Axis troops and material poured into Tunisia to meet the Allied advance. These were the first units of a new Axis force in Africa, the 5th Panzer Army. The Allied march to Tunis would not be unopposed. The Allied leadership's desire to occupy Tunisia can be easily understood. If Tunisia fell, the Allies would be in a position to attack Sicily and take the war forward into the enemy's home territory. But the presence of Axis fighters in Sicily and southern Italy meant that Operation Torch could not land forces directly in Tunisian territory. Allied troops had to advance on the ground to claim the prize. Speed was of the essence. On November the 10th, before the French ceasefire had even been announced, some 33,000 Allied troops left Algiers in the direction of Tunisia. It was possible that their objective could be achieved by Christmas. At first, their progress was good. By the 16th of November, advance units of the British First Army had reached the Tunisian settlement of Souk el Arba. But 4 days later, the first contact with the enemy was made, and Axis air power began to tell as the Allied supply lines were stretched. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 began to appear in North African skies, flying low to harass the advancing Allied infantry. On occasions, the Bf-109 pilots flew so low that not even the famous Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft gun could make an impression. The Allied march forward began to slow as the weather turned for the worse. On the 28th of November, General Anderson launched an assault against the town of Jadida, but the Germans were there in force, armed with giant Tiger tanks. For 2 days the battle raged as all Allied attempts to capture the town were repulsed, with heavy casualties inflicted. There was worse to come. On the 1st of December, the Axis defenders went over to the offensive, pushing the men of the First Army back to the town of Beburba. If any Allied commanders had doubted their enemy's willingness to fight for Tunisia, they could now be sure that this was not the case. Enemy activity was not the only problem for the First Army. The local terrain proved as much of an obstacle as the increasingly visible Axis forces. By the 2nd of December, the main Allied advance had ground to a halt, short of 2 strategic hills, 40 miles to the west of Tunis. One became known as Long Stop. The other was given the name Hill 609. All attempts to capture the hills failed, as heavy storms turned the regional landscape into a nightmare environment of wet, clinging mud. Any sort of infantry advance became impossible. The mud could pull the boots off a soldier's feet. Motorized and armored units also suffered in the harsh terrain. For 3 weeks, the First Army were forced to consolidate their positions. All the time, the forces that opposed them were growing. By the end of November, the newly formed 5th Panzer Army had 15,500 men in Tunisia. By the end of December, it could boast 47,000 Germans and 18,000 Italians. Panzer deliveries included a consignment of the impressive Type 6 Tigers. And the new Axis army was commanded by a respected veteran of the fighting in Russia, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. But the Allied commanders were keen to maintain the initiative. On December the 24th, General Anderson ordered a final push towards Tunis. The British 1st Armoured Division were tasked with the assault, with infantry support deployed against the 2 strategic hills to the north of the front line. In the sodden, muddy conditions, the result was predictable. The British tanks became bogged down, and the infantry found themselves cruelly exposed on the hills. For the men of the Coldstream Guards, Christmas 1942 was a miserable affair, as they wrestled with the enemy for possession of Long Stop Hill. It was a grim business. Despite some initial hard-won progress, the Guardsmen were soon pushed back by withering Axis fire, as Eisenhower realized that he would have to wait for an effective assault on the Tunisian capital. On the 24th of December, the American commander made a visit to the front line. Afterwards, he noted his impression of the conditions. The rain fell constantly. I observed an incident which, as much as anything else, convinced me of the hopelessness of an attack. About 30 feet off the road, in a field that appeared to be covered with winter wheat, a motorcycle had become stuck in the mud. 4 soldiers were struggling to extricate it, but in spite of their most strenuous efforts, succeeded only in getting themselves mired into the sticky clay. We went back to headquarters, and I directed that the attack be postponed. It was a bitter decision. Eisenhower's disappointment was understandable. By the beginning of the new year, a near-static front line had formed, stretching from the Mediterranean inland to the town of Gafsa. First Army now consisted of the British 5th Corps in the north and the American 2nd Corps in the south. Between them, the new 19th Corps, drawn from the French colonial troops stationed in North Africa. It was a long front for one army to deal with. Some individual battalions had to cover a length of 6 miles. Early January was a time for hard patrol duty. Engagements with the enemy were generally small and localized. Allied ground commanders knew there was still much to learn before victory was achieved. But elsewhere, the Allied High Command were already thinking beyond the Tunisia campaign. On January the 14th, 1943, one of the major Allied war conferences opened in the Moroccan city of Casablanca. There was much for Roosevelt and Churchill to discuss. The progress of the Tunisian fighting was high on the agenda. At Casablanca, the decision was made to form a new Allied 18th Army Group under the command of General Sir Harold Alexander. This new command combined the 1st Army in Tunisia with the 8th Army, then advancing through Libya. At the time of the Casablanca conference, Montgomery's men were still in pursuit of Rommel's Panzerarmee Africa, and it would not be long before both forces reached Tunisia. But it was Rommel's colleague, Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who made the next move in the Tunisian fighting. The Allied front line included a French position in the mountain range known as the Eastern Dorsales. The mountain terrain was just one feature of the Tunisian landscape that made for tough fighting conditions in the months ahead. Tight mountain passes, exposed valley plains, and marshy riverbed lands known as wadis all added to the difficulties of effective soldiering. Montgomery's men would find the wadi terrain a particular hindrance during the Tunisian spring. But in early 1943, the Tunisian landscape was not the only problem facing the men of 1st Army. The French troops of 19th Corps were equipped with weapons that were all but obsolete. Their arsenals were designed for colonial administration, not for engagements with German panzer units. General von Arnim was well aware of this. His decision to attack the French sector of the Allied line on January the 18th was well thought, and the French troops soon felt the force of a mechanized monster. At El Alamein, Rommel never received the consignment of 55-ton Tiger tanks that Hitler had promised him. But von Arnim did receive a quota of Type 6 Panzers. Though not quick enough for divisional use, the Tiger's 88mm gun could make a powerful impact on any battlefield, as the French found out on the 18th of January 1943. By the end of January 1943, the Panzerarmee Africa of Erwin Rommel had completed its epic retreat from El Alamein in Egypt to the lands of southern Tunisia. It was an amazing achievement in itself, but Rommel also managed to stay several days ahead of his pursuers, the 8th Army of General Montgomery. As soon as Rommel reached Tunisia, it was obvious that he would take advantage of a fortified defensive position in the south of the country. Known as the Mareth line, this was a series of fortifications constructed by the French colonial authorities prior to the war. It was intended to provide security against any Italian invasion launched from Libya. Though its pillboxes, bunkers and anti-tank defences had fallen into disrepair, the Mareth line could still provide valuable protection for Rommel against the advancing 8th Army of Montgomery. But when the Panzerarmee Africa arrived at the Mareth line on January the 26th, its commander realised that he still had time to spare before Montgomery arrived. So Rommel decided to leave a mainly Italian force of 6 divisions to guard the defences, while he journeyed north with his own armoured Africa Corps. In early February, Rommel considered his next move in discussions with his colleague von Arnim. It was well known that the two men were not best of friends. Rommel considered von Arnim to be unimaginative. Von Arnim thought Rommel to be reckless and impulsive. But the two army commanders were able to put aside their differences as they planned a genuine offensive against the line of the Allied First Army. On February the 14th, 1943, the 10th and 21st German Panzer Divisions launched their attack against positions held by the American Second Corps. The mighty Tigers were again deployed as blitzkrieg warfare came to the Tunisian mountains. An initial assault by Stuka dive bombers paved the way for the German army to break through the Faid Pass as the 21st Panzer Division swept through the mountains to the south. It was an occasion when the anti-tank bazooka weapon failed to make a difference to the outcome of battle. In a matter of hours, the American Second Corps was in retreat towards the Kasserine Pass, leaving 2,500 men surrounded in the hills. On the evening of the 15th, the town of Sidi Bouzid fell to the Panzers after an attempted counterattack by the American 1st Armoured Division ended in disaster. On the open plain, the American tanks were picked off with ease, as Second Corps Commander Lloyd Friedenhall barked increasingly incoherent orders from his distant headquarters. By the 20th of February, Second Corps was formed into a defensive position at the Kasserine Pass, as Rommel's motorised units completed their advance from the southern sector of the front. The Kasserine Pass was strategically vital. If it was captured, the key Allied supply base at Tabesa was also likely to fall. But its defenders could not withstand the German assault on the 20th of February. For the Allies, there was now the real danger of an enemy advance into Algeria, potentially cutting off the First Army from its supply lines. But the Axis forces had to concern themselves with their own extended supply lines, and their commanders argued bitterly about what to do next. Typically, Rommel wanted to be bold, while von Arnim argued for consolidation of the territory gained. Valuable time was wasted in indecision. The Allies also began to fight back. At Tala, the British 6th Armoured Division finally halted the German advance. At Tabesa, it was American artillery that played the key role. It was remarkable that the big American guns were even there. In the previous 4 days, the American 9th Division journeyed some 400 miles from their base at Oran to play their part in the fighting, and they arrived just in time. Now Rommel and his colleagues realized that the advance had run out of steam. Having inflicted 3,000 casualties on the American Second Corps and taken 4,000 prisoners, the Desert Fox decided to withdraw from the mountains of central Tunisia. He was now ready to turn and face an old rival for the last time on the North African battlefield. The Second World War was a conflict that involved vast numbers of men under arms. By the end of February 1943, the North African theatre alone saw 2 army groups locked in combat: the Allied 18th Army Group and the Axis Army Group Africa formed on the 23rd of February, with Field Marshal Rommel in command. But the private, personal element of human rivalry can never be fully removed from warfare, and in North Africa there was no greater personal contest than that between Erwin Rommel and Bernard Montgomery. Both commanders were charismatic figures and a great inspiration to their men. Rommel especially was almost worshipped by his troops during his great victories of 1941 and 1942. But the two men were different in their approach to warfare. Rommel was bold, always looking to exploit any opportunity for the big breakthrough. His rival Monty was more cautious, as he revealed with his steady pursuit of Rommel through Libya after his victory at El Alamein. But in early February 1943, Montgomery's 8th Army finally arrived in Tunisia, and by the 20th, British troops controlled the town of Medenine to the south of the Mareth line. But further progress would be difficult. 6 Axis divisions were in position at the line, as Rommel swept south with 3 armoured divisions of his own to rejoin battle with his great adversary. Having left an Italian division to hold the American Second Corps in the north, the Desert Fox decided that it was time for one of his trademark outflanking manoeuvres. His plan was to bring his panzers to the south of the Mareth line to attack the 8th Army's left flank near Medenine. His intention was to make his move from the slopes of the Matmata Hills, and his chosen date was determined as March the 6th. It was time for the Desert Fox and Monty to test their battle skills once more. Unfortunately for Rommel, Montgomery knew he was coming. Once again, the British code-breaking operation known as Ultra made a vital contribution to the Allied war effort. When Montgomery was made aware of his enemy's intentions, he was able to organize a formidable defensive position all along the line of attack selected by Rommel. Heavily camouflaged anti-tank guns were brought into the line, as Montgomery deployed 2 full-strength divisions, one of them armoured, in the early days of March. All he had to do now was wait. On the morning of March the 6th, Rommel's 3 panzer divisions appeared out of the mist on the slopes of the Matmata foothills. They could not have known they were advancing into a trap. The British gunners waited until the panzers were within a quarter of a mile. Then the assault began. For the first time, the British were able to call on the power of the 17-pound anti-tank gun. Its 76mm shells were able to penetrate armour up to 130mm thick. Not even the mighty Tiger could survive a direct hit from this awesome weapon. Rommel's attack was soon in serious trouble, as panzer wreckage began to clutter the plain. But it wasn't just the big anti-tank guns that made an impression in the Battle of Medenine. The more traditional 6-pound weapon also proved itself. One British gunner succeeded in taking out 8 panzers by himself with his 57mm caliber weapon. It was typical of the day. In a matter of hours, Rommel's proud armoured divisions were in disarray. When the German Field Marshal eventually ordered a retreat behind the Matmata Hills, he'd lost 52 of his panzers. It was the Desert Fox's last action in Africa. On March the 8th, he flew to see his Supreme Commander in an attempt to persuade him to withdraw from the theatre altogether. But Hitler refused to listen, and it was his North African commander who was ordered out of the region. Rommel was already ill with jaundice, and he was sent on sick leave, never to return to the battlefield where he made his name. His rival Hans-Jürgen von Arnim took over his command and waited for Montgomery's next move. In the weeks that followed the Battle of Medenine, both sides took time to consolidate and regroup. Command of the American Second Corps was removed from the incompetent Lloyd Friedenhall and given to George Patton. The new commander moved quickly to restore morale and discipline in the 4 divisions under his command. Patton was also swiftly into action, mounting attacks at the southern end of the eastern Dorsales. His intention was to draw Axis resources away from the Mareth line. Patton knew this was Bernard Montgomery's next objective. In reality, it was obvious to both sides, but although the 8th Army now held the advantage in men and material, the task of breaking through the Axis defences would not be easy. By March the 20th, the British commander was confident enough to make his move. His plan was for his 30th Corps to attack straight into the enemy line, advancing through the riverbed terrain of the Wadi Zigzhou. As a diversionary measure, he also dispatched an infantry division on a huge outflanking maneuver through the desert lands around the Matmata Hills. Just as he had done at El Alamein, Montgomery began his assault on the Mareth line at night. At 22:30 hours on the 20th of March, a huge artillery barrage hammered the mainly Italian defenders. 30 minutes later, the men of 30th Corps advanced into the Wadi Zigzhou with limited armoured support. It soon became clear that the terrain was a formidable handicap. It began to rain heavily on the afternoon of the 22nd of March, and the riverbed ground turned into a sea of mud that proved all but impassable. The Italian defenders, led by General Montgomery, also put up a vigorous resistance to the 8th Army attack. The British had made virtually no inroads into the Mareth line defences, and the afternoon of the 22nd saw a powerful counterattack by the tanks of the 15th Panzer Division. The light British Valentine tanks made an easy target for the Panzers, and the men of the 8th Durham Light Infantry soon found themselves in a desperate battle to hold their position. To the northwest, the supporting attack by Freyberg's New Zealanders also struggled to make any impact south of El Hamma. By the early hours of the 23rd of March, it was clear that the 8th Army attack was not proceeding as well as had been hoped. So Montgomery changed his plan. He decided to turn his diversionary attack into the main thrust of the offensive. 10th Corps and the 1st Armoured Division were dispatched into the desert in pursuit of the New Zealanders. Their intention was to join forces and attack the enemy's rear behind the Mareth line. This was the so-called left hook, to knock the Axis forces out. But the enemy second-guessed Montgomery's thinking. With only a limited British attack in progress against the line itself, the Italian General Montgomery was able to reinforce his rear, setting up a battery of defences against the likely direction of the Allied attack. His firepower included the legendary 88mm German gun, and the 88 proved itself once more when the British armoured units made their move to the south of El Hamma at 1600 hours on March the 26th. Once again, the Italian troops put up a noteworthy defence against the British tanks, but the Axis defenders were not only attacked from the ground. In a devastating raid, a total of 22 squadrons from the British Desert Air Force created mayhem in the German and Italian lines. The aircraft included the Spitfire and the American P-40 fighter bomber, known as the Kitty Hawk in British service. The air assault also featured a British warplane that had proved especially deadly in the fighting at El Alamein. This was the Hurricane 2D anti-tank fighter, armed with two 40mm cannon. Many Allied men referred to the Hurricane as the Tank Buster. Others preferred a nickname that perhaps better described the aircraft's impact on enemy armour. The Hurricane 2D was also known as the Tin Opener. On the 26th of March 1943, the 2D Hurricanes pummeled the Axis defences, and it wasn't long before the 1st British Armoured Division broke through in the direction of the Wadi Akarit. But as the compelling engagement continued, General Messe succeeded in withdrawing his men some 40 miles to a new defensive position south of the riverbed. The retreat was made in good order, and the new Axis defensive line was well chosen. It was a narrow 8-mile length of front, protected by a number of hills. Montgomery may have won the Battle of the Mareth line, but he would need a new offensive to break through at Wadi Akarit. His Italian rival suspected that Montgomery would attack at night, under the light of the next full moon, on April the 19th. Montgomery decided to surprise him. The British commander was now aware of the pressure of time. At the Casablanca Conference of January 1943, it was decided that final victory in North Africa should be achieved by May the 15th, giving the Allies time to prepare for a summer invasion of Sicily. With this in mind, Montgomery decided to attack the Wadi Akarit on April the 5th, under the light of the new moon. This time, the breakthrough was decisive. An attack by a battalion of Gurkhas led to the capture of the strategically vital hill of Jebel Fatnasser, before a mammoth artillery barrage shattered the Italian positions prior to an Allied infantry advance. But once again the Italians fought with a tenacity that many of their enemy thought beyond them, as the narrow front line shook with the force of battle. In the Italian rear, the German 15th Panzer Division added their contribution, but by late afternoon on April the 6th, it was clear that the Allied superiority in men and materials was going to win the day. Messe asked his commander von Arnim to order a general retreat, and his request was accepted. By the end of April the 6th, the Axis Army Group Africa was heading north towards the vicinity of Tunis itself, as Patton's American 2nd Corps engaged from the rear. The following day, 2nd Corps joined up with the advance units of Montgomery's force. 1st Army was now joined with 8th Army, and the final engagements of the battle for Tunisia were just days away. By the middle of April 1943, Adolf Hitler had all but given up on the fighting in North Africa. But his orders were to defend to the last man, and his theatre commander, Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, was willing to fight on till the end. Von Arnim did not know of the Allies' desire for victory by May the 15th, but he was determined to delay the triumph of his enemy for as long as he possibly could. By the 22nd of April, von Arnim had established a final defensive perimeter around Tunis and Bizerta in the northeast of Tunisia. His successful retreat was assisted by a thick minefield that protected his withdrawal from the close attentions of the enemy. The German commander had little choice but to retreat. On the 20th of April, the Allies launched Operation Flax, a huge air and naval blockade of Tunisian territory. All sea and air transports were destroyed by the Allies. Nothing could get through from Italy to von Armin's trapped men, who were now left with virtually no tanks or fuel to run them. By contrast, Allied reinforcements continued to arrive all through the Tunisia campaign. As late as April, General Alexander was able to form an entirely new 9th Corps as part of his 1st Army, and this heavily armoured force was equipped with brand new Churchill tanks, ready for use in the final battle for Tunis. As part of the preparation for the final engagements, General Alexander repositioned Patton's 2nd Corps in the northwestern sector, a massive movement of men that took just 9 days to complete. By the time 2nd Corps was in its new position, it also had a new commander. On the 15th of April, Patton was withdrawn to assist in the preparation for the Sicily landings. General Omar Bradley took command of what was the most northerly sector of the First Army line, and it was the First Army who took the leading role in the final battle for Tunis. Montgomery's superior, Harold Alexander, decided that Bradley's force was in a better position geographically to make the decisive assault. The plains to the west of Tunis were far more suitable for an armoured offensive than the mountainous region around the east coast town of Enfidaville. Alexander's decision to transfer Montgomery's 1st Armoured Division over to Bradley's army made sense in the circumstances. But there was still a role for the 8th Army as the Allied command completed their plans for the final assault on Tunis. On the 19th of April, Montgomery's men attacked the Axis positions in the difficult mountain terrain in an attempt to tie down enemy defences in the region. The result was 2 days of ferocious fighting on the hills, and although Montgomery's men succeeded in capturing the town of Enfidaville, their total gain of territory was just 3 miles. But the 8th Army offensive did achieve the aim of tying down the enemy defences, as 1st Army made ready for their offensive from the west. And as events transpired, the most battle-hardened of Montgomery's men would be involved in the final engagements on the battlefield of Tunisia. On April the 22nd, 1943, the men of the British First Army's 78th Division set about unfinished business from 4 months before. The previous December, the Allied attack on Long Stop Hill to the west of Tunis had ground to a halt in grim winter conditions. In the North African spring, the outcome was different. A heavy intervention from the artillery paved the way for a decisive infantry assault against the hill. At almost the same time, the relocated American 2nd Corps captured Hill 609 with an armoured assault that surprised the Axis defenders. As the Shermans swept over the crest of the hill, the Allied commanders could believe that the path to Tunis and Bizerta was clear, and victory could be achieved before the May the 15th deadline. But the exhausted Panzerarmee Afrika continued to resist. Hitler had ordered that von Armin's men should fight to the end, and in the last week of April, the exhausted force of 175,000 succeeded in holding back the First Army in the west and the Eighth Army in the south. But these two armies comprised some 380,000 men, including some of the most experienced of all desert soldiers. On May the 6th, another massive artillery barrage preceded a British assault against the centre of the line at the Megerda Gap. By the end of the day, they had overcome what was left of Axis resistance. The end was now in sight. The following day, the advance guard of the British 7th Armoured Division swept into Tunis, to the delight of the city's inhabitants. At virtually the same moment, Omar Bradley's Americans arrived in the port of Bizerta to the north. In both locations, the Allies found virtually no resistance. The remaining Axis forces had fled to the Cape Bon Peninsula to the east, where von Armin intended to make his last stand. There was little else he could do. The Allied blockade meant that escape was all but impossible, and von Armin's code of honour compelled him to fight on to the last bullet. German and Italian armoured divisions waited until they had exhausted all fuel and ammunition before surrendering to the Allies. Only then, on May the 12th, 1943, did the fighting come to an end. Tunisia was in Allied hands. And so were the remains of the Army Group Africa. Hans-Jürgen von Arnim was the most senior prisoner taken out of a total which the Allies claimed was some 250,000. The precise number may never be known. What is certain is that only 638 men defied the Allied blockade and reached safety in Italy. On May the 13th, General Alexander was able to inform Churchill that final victory had been achieved, and it had been secured within the designated timescale. Alexander's communication to his Prime Minister was a triumph of factual simplicity. Sir, it is my duty to report that the Tunisian campaign is over. All enemy resistance has ceased. We are the masters of the North African shores. For the Allies, the Tunisian campaign had been an overwhelming success. Americans and British proved they could fight in the same army. The quality and quantity of Allied weapons had also proved significant, and the individual Allied soldier had acquitted himself well in fighting conditions that were often harsh. Their enemy also fought well, with the Italians revealing a newfound stomach for the fight in North Africa. In the end, the undoubted bravery of the Axis troops was not enough to prevail against a numerically superior opponent. Victory in Tunisia meant that Churchill and the Allied leadership could enjoy a moment of cheer. The way was now clear for the Allies to take the war into the enemy's homeland. Sicily, and then Italy itself, would be the next objectives, as World War II came to an end in Africa and headed north into Europe. At the start of 1942, the progress of the Second World War was causing concern for the Allies. Continental Europe was in the grip of the Axis powers. On the Eastern Front, German-controlled territory extended to the fringes of Moscow. On the other side of the world, Japan had just begun its devastating march across the Pacific. By early 1942, the Allies were a long way from winning the war. But by the end of the year, the situation had changed. Christmas 1942 was a time for quiet satisfaction on the Allied side. The American triumph at Guadalcanal had put an end to Japanese expansion. At Stalingrad, the Soviet Union stood on the brink of decisive victory. And the forces of the British Empire had also secured a great triumph in battle. It was so significant that Churchill called it the end of the beginning of the Second World War. Throughout 1942, British and German forces clashed in only one ground battle. North Africa had already seen a British victory in December 1941, when the siege of Tobruk was lifted. But 6 months later, Tobruk was back in Axis hands. It seemed only a matter of time before the fall of Cairo and the end of the Allied presence in North Africa. But the Egyptian capital was saved. By the end of 1942, the Axis forces faced crushing defeat in the North African desert. This turning of the tide was the direct consequence of one epic battle, a 12-day confrontation that gave a hint of things to come. The whole complexion of the war was beginning to change. The North African engagement that began in October 1942 revealed a huge imbalance of resources. For the first time, Allied commanders had the advantage in manpower and material. High-quality equipment from the United States became prolific in the African desert, and American tanks, like the Sherman, proved especially effective. But the Allies also possessed superior tactics and leadership, and for the British officer heading the operation, victory was a great personal triumph over one of the greatest German commanders of the Second World War. This was the duel in the desert between Bernard Montgomery and Erwin Rommel. El Alamein is the name for a tiny settlement near the coast of western Egypt. In 1942, it was an unremarkable trading post. But thanks to the fortunes of war, this small dot on the map gave its name to a famous battle, an engagement that proved to be the decisive chapter in the North African campaign, and a turning point in the war. In September 1940, the British public gave little thought to their country's presence in Egypt. The Battle of Britain and the threat of German invasion were far more immediate concerns. But one man was well aware of the British position in North Africa. Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, the leader of Italy, Germany's partner in the Axis alliance. Italy also maintained a military presence on the African continent, in Libya and in Abyssinia. In 1940, Mussolini drafted a plan to connect the two colonies, beginning with the conquest of Egypt. It was not the first time that the Italian leader had dreamed up a grand military adventure, and like many of his other big ideas, the result was a disaster. Mussolini's troops did not share their leader's hunger for the fight. After the Italians had advanced 60 miles into Egypt, the British Western Desert Force struck back. Although Major General Richard O'Connor had only 30,000 men, compared with 300,000 Italians, the British commander launched a counterattack on December the 7th. This comprised a reinforced infantry assault through the gaps in the Italian line, backed up by an encircling armoured advance. The results were spectacular. Taken by surprise, the Italian invaders were surrounded, and in just 4 days, 38,000 men surrendered. At last, the British regional commander, Archibald Wavell, could send some good news back to London. But the British weren't finished yet. Wavell and O'Connor decided to chase the Italians into the eastern Libyan province of Cyrenaica. On the 6th of January, the British Desert Force captured the Italian fortress of Badia. 16 days later, the port of Tobruk was taken. But the Allies soon faced an unexpected problem. They had not allowed for the thousands of surrendering Italian soldiers. By February the 7th, 130,000 Italian troops had been taken prisoner in North Africa, and the British were the masters of Cyrenaica. But that was the end of the advance. On the 12th of February, Churchill ordered O'Connor to secure his position at El Al-Khaila and release as many men as possible for combat in Greece. It was not the only significant event of the 12th of February. In the Libyan capital Tripoli, a new Axis group arrived, a far more effective fighting machine than the Italians. This was the Afrika Korps, a German force led by a man who became one of the best-known figures of the Second World War, General Erwin Rommel. By April 1941, Rommel was already a giant figure in the German military. A First World War hero, he proved himself early in World War II as commander of the 7th Panzer Division in France. In early 1941, this gifted soldier was given charge of the new German Afrika Korps, and he was quick to enhance his already considerable reputation. Rommel liked to think that he possessed the cunning instincts of the fox. In 1941, the legend of the Desert Fox began to take shape. On April 1st, 1941, Rommel launched an offensive against the British presence in Cyrenaica, with such devastating results that El Agheila fell, swiftly followed by the port of Benghazi. By April 7th, the Afrika Korps had reached Gizala, as the British retreated towards their stronghold at Tobruk. As April passed, events seemed to conspire against the British forces. Their commander, General O'Connor, was taken prisoner on the 6th of April. It was under the command of Sir Noel Beresford Pearce that the British forces formed a defensive line close to the Egyptian border on April the 11th. That same day, Tobruk was besieged, and the men of the 9th Australian Division found themselves cut off in the face of heavy German fire, both from the ground and from the air. Again, the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber proved itself a devastating weapon of war as the Afrika Korps fought to break the Tobruk defences. Over the following months, Tobruk became a familiar name for the British public. By sheer tenacity, the Australians held out, and on May the 4th, Rommel suspended his assault on Tobruk. But the city remained besieged, despite 2 British offensives aimed at raising the siege. Fighting was concentrated in the region of the Halfa Pass, a geographical feature nicknamed Hellfire Pass. There were bitter armoured engagements before both sides chose to consolidate their positions at the end of June. Throughout the summer, the defenders of Tobruk remained besieged, though the Allies managed to withdraw the exhausted Australians in a daring naval operation. From August onwards, a mixture of British, Polish, Indian and South African troops endured the hardships of life in Tobruk. With the Australians before them, these were the famous desert rats, men whose determination became a familiar subject in the newspapers read by the British public. It was a gripping and harrowing story. The situation inside Tobruk was dire. Daily life became a grim lesson in the realities of siege warfare. Food and fresh water were scarce. Many Tobruk veterans recalled a diet of nothing but bully beef for weeks on end. The heat and dust from the desert tested the spirit of the hardest of men, as did the sheer boredom. But outside the siege lines, developments were taking place. As the stalemate at Tobruk continued, both sides made vital changes of leadership. In the summer of 1941, Erwin Rommel was made commander of a new Panzergruppe Afrika, later renamed the Panzerarmee Afrika. The British force became the 8th Army of Lieutenant General Sir Alan Cunningham, under the overall regional command of General Sir Claude Auchinleck. Together, the new British leadership decided on a November offensive to relieve their colleagues still trapped inside Tobruk. Their ambitious plan intended to use the armoured element of the British 30th Corps to outflank the German line in the direction of Gabres-Salé. The more lightly armoured 13th Corps was instructed to engage Rommel. Enabling 30th Corps to sweep up towards Tobruk and lift the siege after 7 long months. The plan was codenamed Operation Crusader, and the offensive began in the early morning of November the 18th. The British commanders were confident of success. Reinforcements had arrived steadily all summer, pushing Allied tank superiority to over 500. Rommel's reaction was uncompromising. Over 4 days of heavy fighting at the airfield of Sidi Rezegh, he succeeded in hammering the British 7th Armoured Brigade in a bitter and confusing tank battle. But Allied reinforcements arrived in time to keep the Afrika Korps confined to the region around Sidi Rezegh. A fierce engagement followed in the desert. Here, the German Afrika Korps counterattacked with 260 tanks in a simultaneous assault against the 5th South African Infantry Brigade and the 22nd Armoured Brigade. The Allied troops found themselves hopelessly outgunned, and the desert soon turned into a scene of absolute carnage as the South Africans fought almost to the last man. Despite their courage, the result of the engagement was soon clear, persuading Rommel to make his boldest move yet, to drive through the remains of the Allied defences and to march into Egypt. This was the dash to the wire, an attempt to reach and penetrate the barbed wire that marked the Egyptian frontier. But it proved to be a serious mistake. The Allies simply allowed Rommel and his troops to pass through their lines before attacking his overstretched supply line in the rear. The Desert Fox had overstretched his forces. It was only a matter of hours before the 8th Army turned this rare oversight to their advantage. In the confusion, Rommel lost touch with his forward headquarters, giving the men of the 2nd New Zealand Division the chance to advance on Tobruk. Almost by accident, the original objective of Operation Crusader lay within the Allies' grasp. By the time Rommel realized his error in dashing for the wire, the 8th Army were fighting their way from Sidi Rezegh towards their besieged colleagues in Tobruk. 2 weeks after the Allies launched the offensive, the German commander was down to just 40 tanks, and he realized that a tactical retreat was the only realistic option. So in early December 1941, the German and Italian forces began their withdrawal, leaving the way clear for the relief of Tobruk on December the 10th. The relief of Tobruk sparked rejoicing in Britain. The British forces had beaten the Germans in a ground engagement, and the success of Operation Crusader seemed to be confirmed by Rommel's withdrawal all the way to El Agheila. But the 8th Army commander, Cunningham, was not part of the celebrations. At the height of the battle, on November the 26th, he was removed from his command and sent to hospital suffering from exhaustion. Major General Neil Ritchie was drafted in to replace Cunningham. He did not have to wait long before the Desert Fox returned, with a vengeance. The remarkable War of Movement continued. In the early months of 1942, Rommel led his Panzerarmee Afrika in a new offensive that forced the British all the way back to the defensive line at Gazala, 25 miles to the west of Tobruk. This seesaw movement of troops and machines became known as the Benghazi Handicap. The coastal city of Benghazi had already changed hands 4 times by the time Rommel launched his attack against the 8th Army's Gazala line on May the 26th, 1942. The change of ownership did not end there, but when the German attack began on the Gazala line, Benghazi seemed a very distant objective for the Allied troops in Africa. The Panzerarmee offensive launched in May 1942 gave Rommel the breakthrough he so badly needed. Within weeks, the Allies found themselves desperately clinging on to their position in North Africa. This was the Axis offensive that set the stage for the Great Battle of El Alamein. On May the 26th, Rommel launched his assault against the Allied defences at Gazala. This was an infantry attack against the Allied line, combined with a panzer outflanking movement to the south. The onslaught produced some of the heaviest fighting in the whole of the North African War, and it was the Desert Fox who emerged victorious. When Rommel's first panzer attack failed to break through as he'd hoped, he decided to rearrange his forces into a defensive position 25 miles south of Kasserine. This became known as the Cauldron, due to the sheer heat of the desert and the intensity of the fighting that took place there. By the first week of June, Rommel stood poised to break out of the cauldron. His panzers and artillery created havoc in the British lines. The Allied soldiers on the ground fought hard to resist, but the 8th Army leadership found itself struggling to cope with the situation. General Ritchie appeared unsure of how to respond, but by June the 14th, with the panzers advancing towards Tobruk, he was forced to make a decision: to order a full retreat to the east. There was worse to come for the British commander. Tobruk was again under threat, and its South African defenders were also uncertain of what to do. Acting on intelligence received, Ritchie ordered defences to be concentrated to the southwest of the town. On June the 20th, Rommel launched his attack from the southeast. It was a fatal decision. Tobruk fell in a matter of hours. Back in Britain, the public despaired as the great triumph of December 1941 was reversed. It became clear that changes in British leadership were needed. 5 days after the fall of Tobruk, General Ritchie was dismissed as the shattered 8th Army attempted to regroup 300 miles away to the east. This was the decision of General Claude Auchinleck, now in personal command of the 8th Army, and it was this solution that may have saved the Allies in North Africa. On Auchinleck's instructions, the 8th Army positioned itself along a 40-mile length of desert front, with the sea to the north and the impassable Qattara Depression to the south. At this time, the Egyptian capital city of Cairo was convulsed in panic. German conquest seemed inevitable. But General Auchinleck knew that if Rommel was going to get to Cairo, he would have to attack the Allied 8th Army directly. The Qattara Depression ruled out the possibility of an outflanking maneuver. In July 1942, the Panzerarmee repeatedly attacked the British line in attempts to break it. But despite heavy casualties, the 8th Army line held, and Auchinleck ordered a counterattack, which was itself repulsed as the desert shook with the full force of war. Despite a succession of fierce engagements, by the end of the month, the fighting had died out, as both exhausted armies consolidated their positions. The Allies' defences were organised into individual fortifications, or boxes, along the length of the front. The most substantial was located around a small coastal settlement called El Alamein. The fighting that took place here in July 1942 is now referred to as the First Battle of El Alamein, but this is not the engagement that is best remembered today. General Auchinleck saw that by establishing defences at El Alamein, Rommel would not be able to use his preferred outflanking manoeuvre. But in London, there was grave concern about the situation in North Africa. The loss of Tobruk was seen as a national humiliation, and although Cairo had been saved, Churchill decided that changes of leadership were needed again in North Africa. On the 4th of August, the British leader arrived in Cairo to inspect the desert situation for himself. For General Auchinleck, it was a fateful visit. Churchill's expedition to the desert convinced him that he should be replaced. Within days, 2 new men were appointed to take over the responsibilities of Auchinleck. At this point, the British commanders of the Battle of El Alamein took to the stage. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery formally took over as commander of the British 8th Army on the 13th of August 1942. Within 3 months, he was a military legend whose name would be forever associated with one Egyptian battlefield. But Montgomery was not the first choice for the command that made his name. Montgomery was originally due to take charge of the British First Army for the imminent Allied landings in northwest Africa, Operation Torch. The Eighth Army was allocated to General William Gott. When Churchill visited Egypt in early August 1942, he was impressed by Gott's command of the British 13th Corps and concluded that he was ready for an army command. But fate dictated that William Gott was denied the chance to make himself a legend. On the 6th of August 1942, Gott received his new appointment as commander of the British Eighth Army. The following day, he took off from Cairo in a Bristol-Bombay transport plane. His destination was the front at El Alamein. But William Gott never reached his destination. Whilst in flight, his aeroplane was ambushed by a squadron of Luftwaffe fighters, forcing the pilot to crash in the desert. Gott escaped from the wreckage, but others remained trapped inside. When the British general attempted to rescue them, the transport plane blew up, killing the newly appointed army commander. Hours later, the commander of the Southeast Army was informed of his new command. Following the tragic death of William Gott, Bernard Montgomery was appointed commander of the Eighth Army in Africa. Born in 1887, Bernard Law Montgomery joined the Royal Warwickshire Regiment in 1908 and was already a platoon commander by the outbreak of World War I. Having been wounded twice and awarded the DSO, by 1918 he'd risen to the rank of Divisional Chief of Staff. He'd also acquired a profound distaste for the carnage that characterized the fighting on the Western Front. When hostilities resumed in 1939, Montgomery was appointed commander of the 3rd Division sent to France, and he was closely involved with the successful evacuation of British forces at Dunkirk. He'd now acquired the nickname Monty, and he cut a distinctive figure with his trademark two-badge beret. By 1942, Monty had become one of the most recognizable faces in the British Army. By the end of the war, he was a national hero. A grand title also awaited Montgomery's superior in Africa, General Sir Harold Alexander. Born in 1891, Alexander first revealed his talents as an officer during the grim fighting of World War I. By the time war broke out again in 1939, he'd risen to the rank of Major General, and he was given a divisional command in the British Expeditionary Force sent to France. It was the beginning of a brilliant war. At Dunkirk, Harold Alexander was also deeply involved with the amazing evacuation of the British Army almost from under the noses of the Germans. A senior command in the jungles of Burma followed, before Churchill appointed him Commander-in-Chief of British Middle East Forces in August 1942. The relationship between Alexander and Montgomery was crucial in the preparation and execution of the El Alamein offensive. Thankfully for the Allies, the two men got on extremely well. Montgomery also enjoyed an excellent relationship with the commander of the Desert Air Force, Air Vice Marshal Sir Arthur Cunningham. The two men agreed that air forces and ground troops needed to work together if strategic objectives were to be achieved. As proof of this, Cunningham placed his headquarters next to Montgomery's in the Egyptian desert. Although it was a practical decision, it was unprecedented at the time, and it symbolized the fusion of land and air power that Montgomery could call on. His German counterpart did not enjoy such a close relationship with his much smaller air force, but his reputation as a military leader led many to believe that he could triumph, whatever the odds. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has always been one of the best-known figures of the Second World War. A charismatic figure with a strong personal presence, Rommel was born in 1891 and, like so many of his generation, saw active service in the First World War. A true hero, Rommel was awarded Germany's highest award for bravery in the course of the conflict, and by the beginning of World War II, he'd risen to the rank of Major General. In 1940, as commander of the 7th Panzer Division, Rommel led a devastating German advance to the coast of the English Channel, earning a Knight's Cross in the process. Shortly afterwards, he became the youngest field marshal in the German army. The German field marshal was convinced of his abilities as a leader, and by 1942, Rommel compared his skills to those of the fox. Almost as soon as he arrived in Africa, he acquired the nickname by which he is still known today, the Desert Fox. But Rommel was not so positive about his colleagues' talents. The structure of the Axis command in North Africa meant that the Desert Fox had to answer to the commander-in-chief of all German forces in the Mediterranean region, Albert Kesselring. Born in 1889, Albert Kesselring first trained as a gunner, but by the end of World War I, his talents had secured him a place on Imperial Germany's General Staff. In the 1930s, he joined the Young Luftwaffe, and by 1939, he was a Luftflotte commander during the invasion of Poland. Kesselring enjoyed a similar command during the Battle of Britain, and despite the German defeat, his career progressed with his appointment as German Commander-in-Chief, South. Later on in the war, Kesselring sealed his reputation as a leader with his imaginative defense of the Italian peninsula. But in Africa, his contribution was less impressive. His subordinate, Rommel, grew convinced that Kesselring was not prepared to commit sufficient air power to the North African campaign, and the Allied advantage in the air proved to be a decisive factor in the Battle of El Alamein. But on the ground, the Panzerarmee Africa was a powerful force, an army of conquest led by a cult-like figure who was virtually worshipped by the men under his command. When Montgomery arrived in Africa, he was alarmed to find that many of his men were obsessed with Rommel and more interested in his next move. Montgomery moved quickly to curb this fascination, but also made his own contribution to the Rommel legend. In his headquarters, he mounted a large photograph of his great rival to keep himself focused on the task of beating this legendary figure. This personal rivalry remains one of the most compelling background elements of the Battle of El Alamein. But this most famous of engagements was not the first time that Monty and the Desert Fox pitted their skills against each other. When Montgomery took command of the 8th Army on the 13th of August 1942, he was concerned at the state of morale amongst some of his men, and he felt that the army lacked a firm leadership structure. The new commander immediately set about establishing his own unchallenged authority, and he was soon able to boost morale in the best way possible. Montgomery suspected that Rommel would make a final effort to break through the Allied line at El Alamein. But he had to consider how the Desert Fox would do this. Given the nature of the desert terrain, the British commander suspected that his rival would adopt tactics similar to those which had succeeded so well before the fall of Tobruk. Montgomery reckoned that Rommel would launch an armoured assault to the south of El Alamein, before attempting to encircle the British defences, leaving the way clear for a march on Cairo. With this in mind, the British commander decided to lure his rival into a trap. He prepared a strong defensive position at the ridge of Alam Halfa, a deadly minefield protected by the men of the 13th Corps, a force that included 2 tank divisions. Montgomery knew that the ground was soft in this region. It was a poor area to carry out an armoured attack. So he decided to try and outwit Rommel with a plan conceived by 2 of his most senior officers, his Chief of Staff, Francis de Guingamp, and Brian Horrocks, newly appointed commander of the British 13th Corps in Egypt. The plan was to give the enemy false information about the terrain occupied by the 8th Army. Montgomery ordered that a staff car should be abandoned in the no-man's land between the 2 sides. Inside it was a fake map, giving the impression that the terrain was good to the south of the ridge. It was a juicy piece of bait, and the Germans took it. When Rommel launched his offensive on August the 30th, his movements were as Montgomery suspected. That day, the German commander ordered a diversionary infantry attack against 8th Army positions in the north, with the main combined force of Italian and German armour to the south. In total, 515 tanks advanced into the soft ground to the south of Halfa Ridge. The British ruse had worked, and General Horrocks was able to talk of the egg having hatched. In the soft conditions, slow German progress was inevitable. The British minefield took a devastating toll as Horrocks' 13th Corps unleashed the power of 300 tanks, several hundred anti-tank guns, and some 64 batteries of artillery. The commander of the 21st Panzer Division was killed, and Rommel soon faced the problem of fuel shortages. The supplies promised to him simply failed to arrive. The Desert Air Force threw up more problems. Not for the last time, the Hawker Hurricane made a substantial impact on the North African battlefield. By September the 3rd, it was clear that Rommel's offensive had failed, and the German commander was forced to withdraw. Montgomery's trickery had contributed much to the outcome of the Halfa battle. Less than a month after arriving in Africa, Montgomery had shown that Rommel was not invincible. Now the commander of the 8th Army turned his attention to a full-scale offensive of his own. He had good reason to do so. In the weeks that followed the Battle of Halfa, substantial reinforcements of Allied men and material arrived in Africa, as Montgomery considered the way ahead. Britain's allies in the United States increased their output of military resources as the American economy adapted to full war production. In early September, a total of 300 American Sherman tanks arrived in Egypt. New American weapons were also supplied to reinforce the British presence in the air, in the shape of 4 squadrons of B-25 Mitchell bombers. Egyptian ports became a hive of activity as new Allied material arrived in the region. By contrast, the Panzerarmee Africa was forced to rely on its existing resources. Hitler promised Rommel substantial reinforcements of men and material. He assured his African commander that brand new Tiger tanks would soon arrive in the region. But the Führer failed to deliver, and as summer turned to autumn, Montgomery knew it was time to take advantage of these German shortages. By October the 6th, 1942, Montgomery had finalized his plan for a general offensive. By October the 23rd, the British commander was ready to make his move. As ever, he exuded confidence. He felt sure that he had the right tactics, the right weapons, and the right troops to secure victory in a second battle of El Alamein. For many people, the Battle of El Alamein was a simple fight between the African forces of Britain and Germany, Monty against the Desert Fox. But although the opposing commanders were a German and a Briton, the forces that they led were drawn from all over the world. Montgomery's army had an especially international flavor. This can be seen clearly on the map of the 8th Army dispositions prior to the Battle of El Alamein. In the north of the front line, the British commander deployed his 30th Corps, made up of the 9th Australian Division, the 51st Highlander Division, the New Zealand Division, the 1st South African Division, and the 4th Indian Division. To the south, Brian Horrocks' 13th Corps included brigade groups of Free French and Greeks, in addition to 2 British infantry divisions and an armoured division in reserve. But Montgomery's main tank force was positioned in the north, in the shape of 10th Corps, with its 3 armoured divisions equipped with some of the finest weapons of the day, including the American-built Shermans and Grants. These forces would have a key role to play in the early hours of the fighting at El Alamein. In all, Montgomery could call on the manpower of 195,000 men, a total that Rommel could only wish for. At first glance, the Axis dispositions at El Alamein were substantial. Rommel was able to call on 12 divisions, whereas Montgomery could muster only 10. But the divisions of the Panzerarmee Africa were all short of their full complement of men, leaving Rommel with a total force of just 105,000, and 55,000 of these were Italians. The majority formed into 5 frontline infantry divisions, with the German 164th motorized completing the line nearest the coast. Rommel's command also included a small reserve force in the north and an all-important armoured presence. 2 Italian tank divisions, alongside 2 panzer divisions, the 15th in the north and the 21st in the south. These were the units who had advanced all the way from El Agheila to El Alamein in just 6 months earlier in 1942, and the panzers would also play a key role at El Alamein. But in terms of sheer quantity of armoured resources, the British enjoyed superiority of numbers. Montgomery could call on 1,000 tanks, a quarter of them the powerful new Shermans. By contrast, the Panzerarmee Africa possessed less than 500 machines, and less than half of these were of German design. 278 of Rommel's tanks were Italian-built. Only 211 Type 3 and Type 4 panzers were available to the German commander, and when fighting commenced, it soon became clear that the Allies had the weapons to deal with the Axis tanks. Of all the weapons deployed at El Alamein, this British single-seat fighter aircraft may be the most famous of all. Powered by a 1,460 horsepower Rolls-Royce engine, the Hawker Hurricane 2D was designed specifically as an anti-tank weapon. It was a modified version of the 300-mile-an-hour Hurricane that proved itself at the Battle of Britain, and the changes were made in the plane's armament. Other versions of the Hurricane were fitted with 12 machine guns or 4 20mm cannon. The 2D used at Alamein was armed with 2 40mm cannon, and this was more than enough to open up a tank in the autumn of 1942. Sometimes known as the Tank Buster, the Hurricane 2D also earned the nickname Tin Opener, and Rommel's ground forces soon found out why. In the course of the Battle of El Alamein, the pilots and gunners of the British No. 6 Squadron terrorized the skies. No German or Italian tank could have hoped to survive a direct hit from the Hurricane's formidable guns. The British Desert Air Force could also rely on a number of fine American aircraft during the desert fighting. The Curtiss P-40 fighter bomber was known as the Kitty Hawk when used in British service, and the pilots of the Desert Air Force shared with their American counterparts a lasting respect for the P-40. Equipped with 6 machine guns and with a bomb capacity of 1 500-pound device and 2 of 100 pounds, the Kitty Hawk earned a reputation as a workhorse rather than a shock weapon, but many a German tank crew found its power more than enough to put them out of action. The British commanders at El Alamein were also well supplied with American weapons on the ground. The M2A1 howitzer was not just one of the most effective weapons of the Second World War. Residual production continues to this day, and the M2A1 can be seen in the arsenals of many contemporary armies. As a means of providing supporting fire for both infantry and armoured advances, there have been few rivals to the M2A1, especially in terms of reliability, and the 8th Army were keen to exploit the firepower of this big American gun right from the start at El Alamein. But of all the American hardware available to the British in the North African desert, the most effective weapon on the ground may have been the M4A1 tank, known to the British as the Sherman. Another weapon famed for its reliability, the British armoured divisions were ecstatic when substantial numbers of these awesome vehicles arrived in the desert ready for use in their October 1942 offensive. First built in 1941, the Sherman provided all the basic requirements of an armoured fighting machine. The protection was a minimum of 15 mm and a maximum of 75 mm, while its main gun delivered a thumping 75 mm caliber shell. The The American constructors knew that this was an ideal combination. In the course of the war, over 48,000 Shermans were built, more than any other tank anywhere in the world. But its operational debut came at El Alamein, and the forces of the Panzerarmee Africa had no answer to it. Among the problems faced by Rommel in North Africa was the relative inferiority of the material available to his Italian units. At El Alamein, as elsewhere, Italian troops relied on weapons like the Semovente self-propelled gun. Armed with a 75mm howitzer and mounted on a tank chassis, the Semovente could not compete in the North African theatre. Lacking in speed, protection and firepower, Rommel knew that weapons like the Semovente stood little chance against superior Allied fire. But he knew that there were a number of fine weapons of German design available to him. Amongst the most famous was the 88mm flak gun. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft gun, the flak gun quickly proved its effectiveness against tanks during the early campaigns of the Second World War. It was admired and feared for the impact of its 20-pound shells, its 6-mile range, and a rate of fire of some 20 rounds a minute. Long after the Second World War came to an end, the 88mm flak gun continued in service in many armies across the world. The gunners of the Panzerarmee Africa could also rely on another well-known artillery piece when battle was joined at El Alamein. This was the 7.62cm gun, a weapon designed not in Germany, but in the Soviet Union. When Hitler opened up the war on the Eastern Front, the initial German advance into Russian territory was devastatingly quick. On many occasions, Stalin's forces were compelled to retreat and leave their heavier weapons behind. Many 7.62 field guns fell into the hands of the invaders. The Germans were so impressed that they copied the design themselves. In North Africa, its 14-pound shells made a powerful impact against Allied armoured units. But despite the power of the anti-tank weapons available to both sides, the war in North Africa is still remembered as a conflict dominated by the offensive capabilities of armoured units. And for the fighting at El Alamein, Rommel was able to call on two well-established tank designs. The Type 3 Panzer was originally designed in 1937, and by the time of El Alamein, the Type 3 was a battle-hardened model. Armed with a 50mm main gun and a maximum 50mm of armour, the Type 3 had accompanied German forces wherever they went in the early years of the war. But this was not the mainstay of the typical German Panzer division in late 1942. That honour fell to the Type 4. No fewer than 9,000 of them were built, and its 5-man crews were especially keen on the power of its main 75mm weapon. Its protection was also substantial, but problems with the Type 4 began to reveal themselves when it was tested against the legendary Russian T-34 during the fighting on the Eastern Front. The Type 4 and the Type 3 were also inferior to the best of the new American machines in both firepower and performance. Field Marshal Rommel was well aware of this, so the German commander was delighted when Hitler promised him delivery of 40 new Type 6 Panzers in the late summer of 1942. But these superior Tiger tanks never arrived in Egypt. That deficiency was something the Allied commanders were determined to exploit. By October the 6th, Montgomery had decided that the main thrust of his attack would be in the northern sector. This was the responsibility of the 30th Corps, commanded by General Oliver Leese. The idea was to weaken the Axis defences with a devastating display of artillery and air power. With this achieved, Montgomery proposed to follow up with an attack by 4 infantry divisions in the north. It was a formidable task. In the late summer of 1942, the Panzerarmee constructed a fiendish defensive position on the Alamein front line. In all, there were 445,000 mines to negotiate, as well as tripwire devices and other booby traps, aptly nicknamed the Devil's Gardens. But the line would have to be breached if 30th Corps were to succeed in their mission. At the same time, in the south, the units of 13th Corps would also move forward. But this was intended as a diversionary tactic to tie down the enemy positions in this sector, including the crucial German armour. Back in the north, Montgomery's own armoured corps would then enter the corridor cleared for them by the infantry, break through the German line, and advance into the open desert. At this point, victory would be assured. Despite the difficulties posed by the German defences, the plan was feasible, and it was given the code name Operation Lightfoot. Montgomery was well aware of his advantage in men and materials, but he also knew that Rommel was expecting an attack at some point, and his rival knew that the attack would have to be directly into his line. The only question was where. So Montgomery decided to play another trick on his enemy, to make the German command think that the main assault would come in the south. To do this, he ordered the construction of a dummy army in the southern sector. In the build-up to battle, a fleet of fake vehicles made of inflated rubber were positioned in the desert. They were joined by fake artillery pieces, fake pipelines, and fake personnel, as all the time the real Allied force was organized under heavy camouflage in the north. Finally, Montgomery ordered the broadcast of bogus radio messages from an imaginary armored division in the southern sector. It was a brilliant enterprise, and the Allied commanders knew that their October the 23rd attack would come as a surprise to their opponents. In the early evening of October the 23rd, 1942, the British 8th Army waited in the North African desert. Montgomery was always keen to give an impression of confidence, and as H hour approached, there was every reason for him to do so. In the battle about to begin, Montgomery knew that the odds were with him. He had the advantage in men and materials. He'd achieved tactical surprise, and Rommel was nowhere near the battlefield. But Rommel would return from his sick leave in Europe and rejoin his men in North Africa, to play his part in the fighting and make his contribution to the historic events that lay ahead. Two armies now faced each other, hundreds of thousands of men prepared for battle. But there would also be a great personal element involved, as Bernard Montgomery and Erwin Rommel faced each other on the desert battlefield of El Alamein. In October 1942, the desert of Western Egypt provided the backdrop for one of the most decisive episodes of the Second World War. For 2 years, the forbidding North African environment had been the location for an amazing war of movement between the Allies, led by the British, and the Axis, led by the Germans. It had all begun in September 1940, when the Italian leader Mussolini ordered an invasion of Egypt by his army based in neighboring Libya. But Mussolini was soon dismayed with the results. The outnumbered British presence in Egypt fought back so well that half of Libya was theirs by February 1941. For Hitler, this was an untenable situation. The Führer's response was to send a new German army to North Africa. The results were cataclysmic. Under the leadership of Erwin Rommel, the new Axis presence pushed the Allies back near the Egyptian border. For 8 months, the port of Tobruk was besieged. Only when Rommel overstretched himself in an attempt to reach Egypt did fortunes change for the Allies. By December 1941, Rommel was retreating, and the trapped men of Tobruk had been liberated. In Britain, church bells rang out in celebration. But the Desert War was not over yet. 1942 saw the Germans strike back. In the first half of the year, Rommel's Panzerarmee Afrika proved impossible to resist. German tanks swept across North Africa. In June, the Axis army won a famous victory at Gizala. Days later, Tobruk was captured, and by early July, Rommel's men had reached Egyptian soil, just 60 miles from the capital of Cairo. Only then were the British-led 8th Army able to hold back Rommel's advance, and the stage was set for one of the most famous engagements of the Second World War. By the late summer of 1942, the two sides faced each other along a 40-mile front line near the Egyptian settlement of El Alamein, and it was the Allies who were preparing the next dramatic stage in the Desert War. Their plan was for a massive offensive against the enemy line. This was Operation Lightfoot, an ambitious scheme conceived by the commander of 8th Army, General Bernard Montgomery, universally known as Monty. Montgomery's thinking was shaped by the geography of the region. The nature of the desert terrain ruled out an outflanking maneuver. The Katara depression to the south of the front line was too unstable for a major military operation. If the Allies were to launch an attack, it would have to be directed straight into the Axis line. This comprised no fewer than 12 divisions, and the Axis disposition included the powerful German armored presence, the Afrika Korps. To reach them, the British-led 8th Army had to negotiate a fearsome minefield up to 5 miles deep. Only then would they come face to face with the troops of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. By October 1942, Rommel was already a legend. Amongst his troops, he was known as the Desert Fox, the man who had secured a famous victory at Tobruk earlier in the year. Fascination for Rommel was also shared by Allied soldiers, much to the anger of the Allied High Command. But the months after Rommel's great victory at Tobruk saw the balance of power in North Africa slowly begin to shift. Throughout the summer, the Allies received substantial reinforcements of men and material, including high-quality weapons from the United States. British commanders were delighted to take delivery of the impressive Grant and Sherman tanks. The Shermans especially would make a big contribution in the deserts of North Africa. By contrast, the Axis reinforcements often failed to arrive, their sea transports falling victim to the power of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean. In the late summer of 1942, Rommel was promised 40 of the new German Tiger tanks. Not one vehicle arrived. By October, Rommel's army was outnumbered and outgunned. The advantage now lay with the Allied 8th Army of General Bernard Montgomery. In comparison with Rommel, Montgomery was a relative newcomer to desert warfare. He'd only arrived in Egypt in August, following the dismissal of General Claude Auchinleck. And Montgomery was not the first choice for the job. On the 6th of August, in the Egyptian capital of Cairo, the British General William Gott received news that he was to be the new commander of the 8th Army. The following day, he boarded a transport plane and took off to inspect the front line of his new command. But General Gott never reached his destination. En route to El Alamein, his plane was intercepted by a Luftwaffe fighter squadron and forced to crash land in the desert. On the ground, the British aircraft exploded, killing the newly appointed 8th Army commander. Hours later, in England, another British general was appointed as Gott's successor. This was the tragic turn of events that led Bernard Montgomery to his destiny in North Africa. The new commander had no experience of desert warfare. At the time of his appointment, Montgomery was commander of the British Army based in the southeast of England. But Monty was quick to prove his battlefield credentials at the Battle of Halfa in early September. This engagement marked the final Axis attempt to break through to Cairo and beyond. It also illustrated Montgomery's ability to lead his men in a successful defensive action. By September the 6th, Rommel halted his attack. Shortly afterwards, he withdrew from Africa altogether to seek treatment for jaundice. In the weeks that followed Halfa, it was his rival who took the initiative in Africa. Montgomery turned his attention to an offensive of his own that would become known to history as the Battle of El Alamein. By the middle of October 1942, Montgomery's trademark confidence was justified. He knew he had the advantage in men and materials. Thanks to the efforts of Allied codebreakers, he was also well informed of enemy activity. Most important of all, he knew that Rommel was hundreds of miles away from the theatre of operations. At the Battle of Halfa, the Axis troops and officers could see that their commander was a sick man. By the end of September, Montgomery knew that he'd flown back to Europe for treatment in the aftermath of the battle. When Montgomery launched his attack in the deserts of Africa, his great rival was convalescing in the mountains of Austria. The British commander was also confident that he'd achieved an element of tactical surprise, having successfully concealed both the scale and direction of his attack. Monty was determined to dupe the German command into believing his main assault would come from the south. To do this, he ordered the construction of a dummy army in the southern sector. In the build-up to battle, a large number of fake vehicles made of inflated rubber were positioned in the desert. They were joined by fake artillery pieces, fake pipelines, and fake personnel, as all the time the real Allied force was organized under heavy camouflage in the north. Finally, Montgomery ordered the broadcast of bogus radio messages from an imaginary armored division in the south. The subterfuge worked. The German commanders failed to plan for an attack in the north, and Montgomery achieved his first success at El Alamein before a single shot was fired. Montgomery also knew that under his leadership, his troops were not as obsessed with his German counterpart as they once had been. Many Allied soldiers had been in awe of Rommel and his Panzerarmee Africa. The cult of the Desert Fox meant that when Montgomery arrived in Africa, he found many of his men more concerned with Rommel's next move rather than the plans of their own leadership. But Montgomery was able to renew their confidence in both their commanders and in their own fighting prowess. So on the 23rd of October 1942, a buoyant Montgomery and a confident Allied army waited for Operation Lightfoot to start. But not even Montgomery could be 100% sure how events would unfold on the battlefield of El Alamein. He was aware, however, of the strategic significance of the battle. He knew that victory would help drive the Axis powers out of North Africa completely. The experience of the battle at El Alamein is almost impossible to convey in words or pictures alone. The heat and the noise and the sheer drama of proceedings can only be appreciated fully by those who took part in the action. A map of the region is also limited in the information it provides. Geographical details can say nothing of the thoughts and emotions that went through the minds of individual men as they awaited the full heat of combat. But the battlefield map does reveal the disposition of the two forces involved at El Alamein. It also charts the progress of the Allied assault. By October 1942, the North African front line was well established. 40 miles in length, its location was determined earlier in the year by the British General Auchinleck during the retreat from Tobruk. It was an advantageous defensive position, stretching south from the Mediterranean coast into the harsh deserts of western Egypt. General Auchinleck knew that the impassable Qattara depression to the south ruled out any outflanking operations. One of the Desert Fox's favorite tactics could not be deployed, and Rommel's direct assaults had failed to break the Allied line in the summer of 1942. But just as the German commander had been forced to attack his enemy's positions directly, so Montgomery was compelled to do the same when it was time for the Allies to fight back. The British commander was only too aware of the size of the task. In the late summer and early autumn of 1942, the Panzerarmee Afrika constructed a fiendish defensive line that included 445,000 mines and a considerable variety of booby traps, including tripwire devices made from modified artillery shells. Barbed wire was laid for miles on end, and advancing Allied infantry would also have to face the attentions of well-dug-in men on the opposing side. The German troops named their defences aptly, the Devil's Gardens, and this horrific construction was just the beginning of the Allied problems. Behind his defensive line, Field Marshal Rommel called on the resources of 12 divisions, including 2 Italian armoured divisions and 2 German panzer divisions, the 15th in the north and the 21st in the south. These were battle-hardened units equipped with the Type 3 and Type 4 panzers. But General Montgomery knew that his resources were far greater. Unlike the 12 Axis divisions, his 10 8th Army divisions were all at full strength. In total, Montgomery could call on 195,000 troops for his offensive at El Alamein. In contrast, Rommel's forces totaled just 104,000, of whom 54,000 were Italians. The North African conflict had done little for the reputation of the Italian armed forces. From the start of the Desert War, the Italian forces were known for their mass surrenders rather than any military achievements. Montgomery was well aware that the Italian elements of Rommel's army were likely to prove a softer touch than their German colleagues. The Panzerarmee Afrika was heavily outnumbered. It was also outgunned. The 8th Army had twice as many artillery and anti-tank guns as their opponents. A similar inequality applied to the numbers of aircraft available to each side. The Allies also enjoyed a massive advantage in terms of the number of tanks at the Battle of El Alamein. Crucially, Montgomery could call on twice as many vehicles as Rommel, and this massive imbalance in armoured resources was even worse than the bare statistics suggest. Again, much of Rommel's nominal strength derived from the Italian elements in his army. He knew that if Italian tanks were excluded, the Allies enjoyed an armoured advantage of 5-1. And Montgomery was also able to call on the new Sherman and Grant models from the United States. In contrast, the Type 6 panzers promised to Rommel by the German High Command had simply failed to reach North Africa. But the Allied command was still wary of the power of German armour. The panzer divisions had proved themselves too often to be taken lightly. So Montgomery proposed an imaginative tactical development for the offensive at El Alamein. Instead of the normal tactic of assaulting enemy tanks immediately in an attempt to leave the infantry exposed, he decided on a new approach, as he described later. "My plan now was to hold off or contain the enemy armor," he said, "while we carried out a methodical destruction of the infantry divisions holding the defensive system. These unarmored divisions would be destroyed by means of a crumbling process, the enemy being attacked from the flank and rear and cut off from their supplies." This grim, crumbling task was the responsibility of the New Zealand Division, which formed part of 30th Corps, commanded by Major General Oliver Leese. This key force of men drew its manpower from across the British Empire and Commonwealth. To the north of the New Zealanders, the 51st Highland Division. Furthest north of all, the 9th Australian Division. Montgomery positioned his 1st South African Division south of the New Zealanders. These 4 divisions were given the key objective of capturing 2 heavily defended ridges, Mitiira Ridge and Kidney Ridge. This was one of the most unremarkable regions on Earth, but in October it became one of the most ferociously contested places ever, as the men of 30th Corps sought to take the 2 ridges. It was in this region that the most bitter fighting would take place, and it was here that the outcome of the Battle of El Alamein was decided. Thirtieth Corps' responsibilities did not end with the attack against the 2 ridges. To the south, the 4th Indian Division were assigned with making supporting attacks in the region of Ruwaizat Ridge, but it was the northern sector of 30th Corps' front that was central to the success of Operation Lightfoot. Montgomery planned for the engineers and infantry to go forward into the fearsome German defensive positions, to clear a path through the Devil's Gardens. The intention was to create an opening for the 3 armoured divisions that made up the 10th Corps of Major General Herbert Lumsden. 10th Corps was well equipped, having recently received reinforcements of American Shermans and Grants. But Montgomery was keen for them to face as little in the way of enemy armour as possible. So the job of Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks' 13th Corps was straightforward. As 30th Corps made their move in the north, Horrocks' men were to stage a diversionary attack in the south and keep the crucial 21st Panzer Division busy in this sector. 13th Corps was another international body of men, including 2 brigade groups of Free French forces and 1 infantry brigade group from Greece. It also possessed its own armoured division in reserve. This was the disposition of Montgomery's 8th Army on the evening of the 23rd of October 1942. On that evening, as always, the British commander exuded confidence. He had promised Churchill nothing less than complete victory, and he knew he had the advantage in manpower and materials. He was also confident that he'd achieved tactical surprise with his use of camouflage and misinformation in the weeks leading up to the offensive. And Montgomery also possessed the precious knowledge that his great rival was not even in Africa at the time. As H-hour approached, Rommel was convalescing in German-occupied Europe. There was no better time for the 8th Army to strike. As dusk fell on the 23rd of October, the Allied forces braced themselves for an operation that would prove to be a decisive episode in the Second World War. At 21:40 hours on the 23rd of October 1942, near the Egyptian settlement of El Alamein, the British 8th Army announced the beginning of Operation Lightfoot in the most dramatic manner possible. Across 40 miles of front, a huge artillery barrage was unleashed. For 15 terrifying minutes, 1,000 guns fired their shells into the Axis defence lines, in an attack that unnerved many men on the Allied side. At 21:55, the barrage stopped, but it was only a temporary respite for the Axis forces. Just 5 minutes later, the Allied guns opened up again. This time they fired in support of the engineers and infantry who advanced into the fearsome German defences, the minefields and booby traps of the so-called Devil's Gardens. In the area allocated to the 51st Highland Division, the sound of the bagpipes could be heard in the desert night as the Scots troops began their advance. As the Germans and Italians realized what was happening, they positioned their guns and responded with an artillery bombardment of their own against the advancing Allies. The Battle of El Alamein had begun. The Allied engineers knew that they faced a hard night's work. Their task was to defuse or disable a variety of anti-personnel and anti-armor devices, as shellfire from both sides pounded the ground around them. For the first time in the Desert War, the sappers were equipped with mine detectors, but many experienced men preferred to rely on their fixed bayonets to locate the enemy devices. By midnight on the first evening, the first paths through the minefield were being cleared, and lanterns lit the way for the infantry advance in the direction of the Mitiara and Kidney ridges. In the southern sector of 13th Corps, the Allied troops also exposed themselves to the full peril of battle. Here, the infantry advanced without armoured support, Montgomery having decided to keep the 7th Armoured Division in reserve. In this sector of the desert, the Free French units found themselves in the thick of the fighting at the southern tip of the front around Kharat el-Himamat. Although 13th Corps failed to break through the German defences, their main task was achieved in the first 24 hours. Their relentless fighting forced the Axis to keep its crucial 21st Panzer Division in the region, as all the time the main Allied attack continued in the north. Here we can see the objectives of 30th Corps in greater detail. To secure a route for the British armour, Montgomery devised a two-pronged attack against the powerful German defences centred on Mitiara and Kidney ridges. In the south, the New Zealanders and South Africans were instructed to create a corridor for the advance of the 10th Armoured Division. Further north, towards Kidney Ridge, the Highlanders and Australians' responsibility was to clear a path for the 1st Armoured. This was a demanding enterprise in the full face of enemy gunfire, but the operation began well. By 0200 on the 24th, just 4 hours into the battle, the Highlanders and New Zealanders had made especially good progress, and the Allied armoured units began their advance exactly on schedule. By dawn, the New Zealanders had secured a position beyond the Mitiara Ridge, and the enemy had taken heavy losses. The Italian Trento Division and the German 164th Motorized Division suffered especially badly, and the morning of the 24th witnessed another serious blow to the Axis cause. Before midday, Rommel's stand-in, General Stumme, suffered a fatal heart attack as he toured the battlefield. This forced the Panzerarmee to turn to Major General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma for leadership when it desperately needed the inspiration of Field Marshal Rommel. By now, the great German commander had been informed of the Allied offensive, and plans were already in place for the Desert Fox to return to Africa to take charge of his men. But by the 24th of October, to the Allies' alarm, not everything was going their way. That day, the Panzers hit back. 15th Panzer Division concentrated its fire on the two-pronged Allied assault on the major ridges. Supporting fire was provided by another legend of the war in the desert, the 88mm gun. This fearsome weapon had originally been designed for anti-aircraft use, but its 20-pound shells proved equally effective against ground targets, especially Allied tanks. Rommel's army was also well equipped with another fine field weapon, the 7.62cm gun. These were weapons of Soviet design, but they'd so impressed the German army that they simply stole it. By late 1942, this field gun was being mass-produced in the Soviet Union and in Germany. By the 24th of October that year, German gunners were appreciating its power. "24 hours after Operation Lightfoot kicked off, the progress of the British armoured units was not all that Montgomery had hoped for. And the 8th Army commander began to suspect that it wasn't just the attentions of the enemy that were hampering progress. Though the 1st Armoured Division had forced its way through to the other side of the German minefield, the units of 10th Armoured Division found themselves in real difficulties. The nature of the terrain hardly helped progress. The ridge provided good cover for the defending Axis forces. There was also the difficulty of war wreckage blocking the way through the corridor that the infantry had fought so hard to secure. Burning Allied tanks also provided excellent target identification for the pilots of the Luftwaffe. But the British 8th Army commander had another concern. He suspected that there might be a problem with the leadership of 10th Corps as a whole. It was common knowledge that Oliver Lumsden had not approved of his commander's decision to employ his armoured resources in support of the infantry crumbling operations. Lumsden believed in a more mobile style of tank warfare, and as the 24th of October went on, Montgomery became increasingly convinced that his subordinate was not fully committed to the task in hand. He was also outraged when he heard that the commander of 10th Armoured Division was located some 10 miles behind his leading units. His response was telling. First of all, Montgomery ordered the commander of 10th Armoured to go up to the front and take charge of his men directly. Then, at 02:30 hours on the morning of the 25th, the 8th Army commander convened a meeting in his headquarters. Present were Generals Leese and Lumsden, the commanders of the 2 Northern Sector Corps, and Montgomery got straight down to business. He reminded the 10th Corps commander that he was in overall charge of Operation Lightfoot, and it was down to Lumsden to do his duty in executing his part of it. Suitably chastened, the 10th Corps commander returned to his men. The meeting achieved the impact that Montgomery had hoped for. Afterwards, the British commander suggested that it might have been the decisive moment of the battle. By the morning of the 25th, the 2 prongs of the British armoured advance had reached positions beyond the ridges as the Axis drew back into a new defensive line. The New Zealanders had also cleared the minefield, as all the time the Type 3 and Type 4 panzers of 15th Division continued to resist. All through the 25th, the panzer counterattacks continued. But all the time the British anti-tank weapons made their presence felt. By the end of the day, the 15th Panzer Division had lost 75% of its precious vehicles, and the overall imbalance of materials was beginning to make a difference. It wasn't only the anti-tank guns that caused havoc in the panzer lines. Throughout the Battle of El Alamein, the support of the British Desert Air Force was crucial. Air Vice Marshal Sir Arthur Cunningham commanded an awesome force of warplanes. At the peak of the action, some 800 bomber sorties and 2,500 fighter bomber sorties took to the air in a single day. Cunningham's aircraft included the Hurricane, armed with a 40mm anti-tank gun. This proved so devastating, the Hurricane became known as the Tank Buster, and a direct hit from a Hurricane's big gun meant only one fate for an Axis tank crew. Not for nothing was the Hurricane also known as the Tin Opener. But despite the huge contribution of this superb warplane, the first 48 hours of Operation Lightfoot failed to make the clear breakthrough the German lines that the British commanders had hoped for. So on the 26th of October, Montgomery began to prepare a second stage to the El Alamein offensive. As part of the groundwork, he decided that the exhausted New Zealanders deserved a rest, so he withdrew their division into reserve, moving the South Africans and Indians north to fill their place. The decision did not go down well with Churchill, however. The 26th of October also saw changes in the disposition of Montgomery's enemy. That evening, Rommel returned from his hospital treatment in Europe and was struck immediately by the terrible losses endured by his 15th Panzer Division. He also recognized that Montgomery had achieved tactical surprise with his diversionary attacks in the south. The Desert Fox knew that he had to move quickly if there was to be any chance of a fight back. On the 27th, the same day that the South Africans and Indians moved north, Rommel ordered his own 21st Panzer Division to move in the same direction. Once they had passed the Ruwaisat Ridge, the German commander then positioned a force of 106 tanks for an attack against the Allied positions on Kidney Ridge. The result was a day of furious tank warfare in the desert. Rommel later described his feelings as he committed his men to the fighting for Kidney Ridge. It is one of the realities of war that the most insignificant places can take on an extraordinary value in the heat of battle. And this was entirely true of the confrontation at El Alamein, as Rommel described. Rivers of blood, he said, were poured out over miserable strips of land, which in normal times not even the poorest Arab would have bothered his head about. At El Alamein, Kidney Ridge was the most bloody of all Rommel's miserable strips of land. But the Panzer Army commander knew its importance to the outcome of the battle. On 5 occasions, the panzers unleashed counterattacks against the Allied presence on the ridge. On all 5 occasions, they were repulsed. Rommel's armoured resources were already badly depleted, but 50 more German tanks were destroyed on the 27th of October, a day that again proved the devastating power of the Hurricane. With the failure of this bold counterattack, the Desert Fox began to suspect that he would soon be the prey of his Allied opponents. But in London, the British leadership was concerned with the progress of events in Western Egypt. Churchill was only too aware that the clean breakthrough into open desert had still not been made. When he heard of Montgomery's decision to withdraw the New Zealanders into reserve, he began to doubt the intentions of his commander on the ground. On one occasion, Churchill flew into a rage at the news from Africa. But his senior advisers argued that Montgomery knew exactly what he was doing, and the British leader came to accept their opinion. Back in Africa, the British commander knew that the battle was going his way. Before the offensive began, Montgomery had suggested that victory would require 10 to 12 days of fierce engagements. He used the phrase "killing match" when giving his men an idea of the kind of battle they would have to fight. 4 days into the battle, the evidence on the ground proved that Montgomery's choice of phrase was accurate. But however long the killing match took, Montgomery was confident that final victory would be his. By the 27th of October, the 5th day of Operation Lightfoot, he knew that enemy losses were becoming unsustainable, and his own tank advantage was constantly growing. Though Rommel's line still held, Montgomery was sure that the Allied superiority in men and material would eventually force the decisive break through the Axis line and into the open desert beyond. But it would still be a hard fight, and Montgomery decided that he needed the power of his 7th Armoured Division brought up from the south. Though fighting continued in the southern sector, the real focus of the El Alamein offensive was now exclusively in the north. On the 28th of October, Rommel launched another panzer attack against the Allied position on Kidney Ridge. Once again, the German armour was turned back as the ridge turned into a nightmarish scene of wreckage and death. The German tank crews fought tenaciously, but there was little they could do to protect themselves from the bombs of the Desert Air Force. By the end of the 28th, Rommel's brave counteroffensive had been repulsed. Further north, the Australians engaged themselves in a diversionary attack to drive a wedge into the enemy line and cut off the German 164th Motorized Division. Montgomery's own chief of staff felt that this was the fiercest confrontation of the whole Battle of El Alamein. But as the Australian assault continued, Allied troops engaged in grim close-quarter fighting across all sectors of the front throughout the 28th of October. The battlefield was littered with the debris of war. Corpses rotted in the desert. The ruins of tanks, aircraft and field weapons lay everywhere. A thick, penetrating dust enveloped the whole of the battlefield, and the fighting was still not over. Allied soldiers had been promised that the action could take up to 12 days. 6 days on, the breakthrough had still not been made, and many 8th Army men wondered how long it would be before success was theirs. But the British commander was already hatching the second stage to his offensive at El Alamein. On the 29th of October, his own regional commander, General Harold Alexander, arrived at his field headquarters, and there was only one serious item for discussion. This was Montgomery's plan for securing the breakthrough at El Alamein. Codenamed Operation Supercharge, it represented Monty's proposal to convert his material advantage into final victory. His plan was for the 8th Army to make a concentrated attack in the northern sector of the front line. Against an outnumbered enemy, this would be enough to shatter the Axis defenses and allow the Allies through into the open desert and bring the battle to a successful conclusion. The proposal made sense to General Alexander, but there was concern that Montgomery's intention was to make the attack in the very north of the front line. Alexander and other senior officers felt that this was unwise, since that this was where a high proportion of Axis troops were Germans. Given the evidence of the 2 years of war in the desert, the British command knew that an assault on a mainly Italian sector of the line was likely to be less costly in terms of Allied lives and resources. When Montgomery heard that Rommel had brought up his final reserves and deployed them against the Australians near the coast, he accepted the merits of the argument. By the end of October the 29th, it was decided that Operation Supercharge would be launched along a front 2.5 miles wide in the region to the north of Kidney Ridge. 8th Army would attack the boundary of the German and Italian positions, and D-Day was determined as the 2nd of November, 1942. But there would be no respite in the battle before then. In the days that followed the acceptance of Operation Supercharge, the fighting continued all along the front. In the north, the Australians almost succeeded in cutting off a large German presence at the coast. But although the German Panzergrenadiers were able to escape, the courage of the Australians kept Rommel's attentions focused in the north, while Montgomery made his plans for the decisive attack to the south. By late evening on November the 1st, the Allied preparations were complete. The final stage of the Battle of El Alamein was about to begin. The launch of Operation Supercharge on the 2nd of November 1942 had much in common with the beginning of Operation Lightfoot just over 9 days previously. It took place at night, with H-hour set at 0100 hours. And it began with a fearsome artillery barrage, backed up by strong support from the air. When the attack began, a total of 300 25-pound guns unleashed their shells on the narrow strip of front line. Once again, the Axis forces were driven into a desperate defensive position. As with Operation Lightfoot, the barrage of shell fire provided cover for the advance of the Allied infantry, and their task was once again to clear a path for the armoured units. But Supercharge had one big tactical difference. The aim was to secure just one corridor through the Axis lines, a task given to the men of the 151st and 152nd Infantry Brigades. As they began their advance in the early hours of November the 2nd, they knew that the decisive hours of the battle lay ahead. As ever, Montgomery remained confident that his plan would succeed. But as Operation Supercharge got underway, the Panzerarmee Africa revealed a great enthusiasm for the fight, despite their heavy losses of men and materials. The Axis forces also faced a catastrophic shortage of fuel and ammunition, but Rommel was still able to contest Montgomery's assault. As the two Allied infantry brigades moved forward, the Desert Fox formed up his remaining panzers alongside Italian anti-tank gunners, who proved surprisingly keen to continue the fight. The scene was set for a day of terrible fighting, as the aircraft of the Desert Air Force powered overhead. The objectives of the Allied infantry were soon achieved, and the British 9th Armoured Brigade was able to lead the tank advance into the Axis line. But it was a bloody business. The Italian gunners proved especially effective, as daylight broke and they opened fire from ranges of as little as 20 yards. The consequences were predictable and destructive. In a matter of hours, the 9th Armoured Brigade lost 70 out of its complement of 94 tanks, and the terrifying sound of men trapped in burning vehicles echoed across the front line. In all, some 200 Allied tanks were lost on November 2nd, 1942. It was a heavy toll to take, but Montgomery knew he could bring in reinforcements if needed. In contrast, Rommel now faced a worsening situation. By the end of the first day of Operation Supercharge, his total complement of panzers had shrunk to just 35. Not even the Desert Fox could fight on in such a situation, and on the evening of the 2nd, Rommel knew that the end was near. That night, he made preparations for a retreat. The Allies had won the battle, but the Desert War was not over yet, if the Panzerarmee Africa could withdraw to fight another day. But Rommel's masters in Berlin had other ideas. At 13:30 hours on the 3rd of November, the Axis retreat was already underway when Rommel received a message from Hitler. Its tone was typically uncompromising. Rommel was ordered to stay put, to fight to the last man, to show his troops no other road than victory or death. Erwin Rommel received the message with a heavy heart. In military terms, Hitler's orders meant suicide. The Panzerarmee Africa was beaten, and its commander knew that his task now was to cut his losses and withdraw as much of his force as he could. But Field Marshal Rommel was compelled to obey the command of his Führer, and on the afternoon of the 3rd of November, he set about reorganizing a front line which still just held its integrity. In the circumstances, his tactics were predictable. Axis field guns concentrated their fire on the inevitable gaps in the line, and these succeeded in preventing the final breakthrough. The Desert Fox also launched a barely credible counterattack early on the 4th, using what was left of his panzer force. But it was now only a matter of time. On the afternoon of the 4th of November, in the region around Tel El Akhakir, the decisive breakthrough was made, and a hole 15 miles wide opened up in the Axis line. The outcome of the Battle of El Alamein had been reached. Montgomery's offensive had succeeded, and it had taken a few hours short of 12 days to achieve. His estimate of the duration of the battle was uncannily accurate. Even Hitler was forced to accept the inevitable, and late on the 4th of November, he revoked his original order for Rommel to stand fast. The Desert Fox could now concentrate on the task of escaping towards Axis positions hundreds of miles to the west. Even before Hitler's new order came through, many Axis forces had accepted defeat. Dozens of infantry units found themselves surrounded, and gave themselves up to the Allies. Not for the first time in Africa, Italian troops surrendered in their thousands, and many pondered the decision of their leaders to involve their country in the Desert War. But their German commander was determined to withdraw himself and as many of his troops as he could. Rommel wanted to fight on another day. With 3 Allied armoured divisions in hot pursuit, the Desert Fox set off along the coast road in a shambolic procession of tanks and lorries filled with exhausted troops. The attentions of the Desert Air Force only added to their difficulty, and Rommel was soon reduced to a total of just 10 tanks. But his flight was not stopped. Montgomery now displayed a cautious streak. On the one occasion that he did order an outflanking maneuver against Rommel's convoy, the attempt was thwarted by poor weather, and by the 20th of November, the retreating force had succeeded in reaching El Agheila. By now, the Allies were 4 days behind him, and the German commander was eventually able to reach the Axis city of Tripoli ahead of his pursuers. The great rivalry between the Desert Fox and his British adversary Monty was not over yet. Many commentators have suggested that Montgomery should have ordered a more vigorous pursuit of the fleeing Rommel. But the British commander had learned in the Great War that an unnecessary waste of manpower was always a mistake, and Montgomery knew that he could take his time as he announced that his next target would be the Axis-held city of Tripoli, the capital of Libya. He was aware that the Axis powers in western Libya and Tunisia were under attack from 2 sides from the 8th of November onwards. This was the date for the Allied landings in North Africa known as Operation Torch, a huge enterprise that achieved its strategic objective. By May 1943, the Axis powers had been driven out of Africa altogether. Montgomery could also be certain that he had won a famous victory in the 12 days of fighting at El Alamein. The statistics of the battle leave no one in any doubt. Of 105,000 Axis troops deployed, some 25,000 were listed as casualties, and a total of 30,000 were taken prisoner. Material losses were also substantial. 1,000 guns of the Panzerarmee Africa were destroyed or captured. 320 Axis tanks suffered the same fate. By contrast, the 8th Army suffered 13,000 casualties, and only 250 of its tanks were put out of action for good. Back in Britain, victory at El Alamein prompted national celebrations. Some commentators have chosen to describe Montgomery as a lucky general, and a number of common arguments are still used to justify this opinion. It's pointed out that he had the good fortune to command an operation where the Allies enjoyed numerical superiority for the first time. Others have drawn attention to the fact that Montgomery inherited a sound defensive position from his predecessor, General Auchinleck. The British commander's failure to capture Rommel after the battle is also a point that's been raised by many. Bernard Montgomery's leadership revitalized the Allied forces. From the moment he arrived in Africa, he filled his men with a confidence lacking after the fiasco of Tobruk. The cult of Rommel became a thing of the past amongst the Allied troops. In his preparation for El Alamein, he revealed a mastery of cunning tactical thinking, and throughout the fighting he maintained his belief in final victory even when doubts were expressed at the most senior of levels. And victory would be his reward. In 1946, after the war had ended, the achievements of Field Marshal Montgomery were recognized by his grateful nation. Though the triumph in North Africa was not the end of Monty's war, it remains the source of his enduring fame. In 1946, he recognized this himself when he took the new title given to him by Britain. And Bernard Montgomery became Viscount Montgomery of El Alamein.